She was bleeding on his dead mother's wedding veil. Not a small stain, a real one, dark, spreading through 40-year-old Venetian lace like a secret that refused to stay buried. And the man standing in the doorway of that rain-soaked garment house? He wasn't the kind of man who asked questions twice. Dante Bellavere had buried enemies in concrete. He had ordered silence with a single look. But watching that small woman in the corner try to hide her shaking hands beneath white lace gloves, something in him went very, very still. This is the story of a woman who survived by disappearing, and the man who refused to let her. If this story moves you, stay until the end. Hit like. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The garment house on Carmine Street smelled the way old buildings always smell when they've absorbed too many lives. Machine oil, damp wool, the ghost of cigarettes smoked by people who no longer existed. 3 floors of brick and iron, windows filmed with the grime of 40 New York winters, pipes that knocked and groaned through the walls like something restless and unburied. It was the kind of place that didn't appear on any of Dante Bellavere's official paperwork, which was, of course, exactly the point. Mara Voss had worked there for 11 months. She knew which floorboards to avoid after dark. She knew that Mrs. Kowalski on the second floor ran the cutting tables like a military operation and tolerated no small talk before 8 in the morning. She knew that the freight elevator on the north side stuck between floors 2 and 3. If you didn't hold the gate closed with your shoulder, the whole ride up. She had learned these things the way she learned everything, quietly, carefully, by watching and waiting and making herself as small as the space allowed. She was good at small. She had practiced it her entire life. The morning it all came apart started like any other. Rain on the windows, the smell of coffee from the break room 2 doors down that nobody ever quite cleaned properly. Mara arrived before 6, before most of the other women, because she preferred the building when it was still half asleep. She liked the quiet. She liked the way the machines sat covered under their canvas sheets like patient animals waiting to be useful. She liked being alone with fabric and thread, and the particular kind of silence that didn't require anything from her. She had a commission that morning, a private one, passed down through Mrs. Kowalski with the kind of careful, lowered voice instruction that told Mara not to ask questions. A wedding veil. Old, very old, Venetian needle lace with a border pattern that must have taken someone months to complete by hand. There was a small card tucked in the tissue paper. 2 words in a precise, old-fashioned script. Bellavere. Urgent. Mara had seen that name before. Everyone in this building had. You didn't work at Carmine Street and stay innocent of who ultimately signed the checks. But a name on paperwork was different from a name on a commission card. A commission card meant the thing mattered personally. Personally meant she needed to be perfect. She sat up at the long work table near the north window where the morning light was best, diffused, gray, merciless to flaws, and began to examine the veil with the magnifying glass she kept in her kit. The lace was extraordinary, even damaged, even with 2 sections of the border completely separated and a third pulling dangerously at a junction point. She could see the quality of it. Someone had made this with love, or at least with the kind of obsessive attention that lived in the same neighborhood as love. She worked slowly. She always worked slowly at first, diagnosing before she committed. Her kit was open beside her. Needles in their velvet roll, thread in 8 weights ranging from gossamer to substantial, a small jar of the beeswax she used on the heavier threads, her scissors with the worn wooden handles her mother had left her. The gloves were already on. They were always on. Thin white cotton, seamstress gloves, the kind that kept the oils of your skin off delicate fabric. Nobody looked twice at gloves in a garment house. That was the other reason she wore them. She had been working for perhaps an hour, so deep in the repair that the rain and the groaning pipes had faded entirely from her awareness when she felt it. That particular sensation, familiar as breathing, horrible as it always was, of the skin at the base of her left ring finger splitting open again along its oldest scar. She stopped, breathed through her nose, slow and even, pressed the finger against her palm without looking at it, the way you'd press on something you didn't want to acknowledge. She had maybe a minute before it would bleed through the cotton. She should have stopped and gone to the washroom. That would have been the sensible thing. Instead, she looked at the veil spread before her on the table. At the junction point she'd been building toward for the last 20 minutes, at the way the thread was sitting exactly right for the first time all morning. Her hands knew something her brain hadn't caught up to yet. She kept working. This was her first mistake of the day. There would be others. By the time she registered the blood, a small spot, dark against the white lace, spreading with horrible certainty, she heard the door. Not the regular door, the one employees used, the one with the broken buzzer that Mrs. Kowalski kept meaning to fix. The other door, the one at the far end of the room that was always locked, that connected to the back stairwell, that nobody with any sense asked about. That door opened without a sound. Dante Bellevere was not what the stories made him. The stories, the ones whispered between cutting tables, traded in the break room over terrible coffee, made him into something operatic. A dark lord. A monster in a good suit. The reality was more unsettling than the mythology because the reality was a man who looked like someone's serious older brother, dark hair going silver at the temples, a face that had been handsome once and was now something harder and more interesting, wearing a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than Mara made in 3 months. He wasn't tall in the way that announced itself. He was just present in a way that rearranged a room. He stopped just inside the door. His eyes moved across the space the way a person's eyes move when they're used to reading rooms for danger. Fast, thorough, almost involuntary. Then they landed on her. She had both hands flat on the table and she was perfectly still, in the way that small animals go still when something larger enters their field of vision. The spot of blood was between her left hand and the veil's border. She didn't look down at it. Looking at it would make it real. Dante looked at it for her. He crossed the room without hurrying. He had the kind of walk that said he'd never needed to hurry for anything in his life. Not because he was lazy, but because he was the kind of man who arrived after the fact and found everything waiting. He stopped on the other side of the work table and looked at the veil, then at her hands, then at her face. "You're bleeding on it." His voice was low. Not gentle exactly, but not loud the way she'd expected. Not theatrical. Just a flat statement of fact delivered with the certainty of a man who said things once. "I know," Mara said. "I'm sorry. I'll fix it." "How?" "There are processes. For old lace, there are ways to lift staining without damaging the fiber. I've done it before." She was already reaching for her kit with her right hand, the uninjured one, keeping her left pressed against the table. "It won't show." "That's not what I asked." She looked up at him then. He was watching her left hand with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not anger, not concern exactly, something in between that sat uncomfortably in the space where those two things met. "Sir," she said, and the word tasted strange in her mouth, too formal for the situation, not formal enough for who he was. "I'll take care of it. The veil will be finished by end of day. I give you my word." "Your word." He said it the way you'd repeat a word in a language you were still learning, testing the weight of it. "Take the glove off." The room got very quiet. Outside, rain hit the windows in a gust. The pipes knocked twice and fell silent. "It's just a cut," Mara said. "Occupational. It happens." "Take the glove off." There it was again. Not louder, not angrier, just final. The kind of voice that had learned it didn't need volume to mean what it said. She took the glove off. She kept her face neutral while she did it. She had practiced that particular neutrality for years. The face of a person showing you something ordinary. Nothing to see here. Just move along. Her hands were not ordinary. They had not been ordinary for 4 years. The scarring ran across the knuckles of both hands in patterns that didn't look accidental because they weren't. Raised. Deliberate, the kind of damage that takes time and intention to inflict. Her fingers still bent correctly, mostly. A doctor had told her she'd been lucky. She had decided not to think too hard about what unlucky would have looked like. Dante looked at her hand for a long time. He didn't touch it. He didn't say anything. The expression on his face shifted into something she couldn't catalog, something that went quiet and cold in a way that had nothing to do with her, that seemed to be directed somewhere she couldn't see. "Who did this to you?" he said. It wasn't a question. The inflection was all wrong for a question. "I don't think that's... I'm not asking for my health." Mara picked up her right-hand glove from the table. She set it back down. She looked at the ruined spot on the wedding veil, already smaller in her estimation than it had seemed a minute ago. Treatable, survivable, if she moved quickly. And she made a calculation, a fast one, the kind her body had gotten very good at making over the last 4 years. What is the cost of telling the truth here versus the cost of not telling it? I owe a debt, she said finally. My brother owes a debt. The men who hold it, they made a point about what happens when you miss a payment. Dante's jaw moved. A small thing, barely visible. What men? Mr. Bellevere. She said his name deliberately, making it a boundary. I came here to work. I came here to fix your mother's veil. I'm asking you, please, to let me do that and nothing else. Something moved in his face then that she didn't expect. Not anger. Something more complicated than anger, and somehow more dangerous. My mother, he said slowly, spent 31 years making things with her hands. She taught every woman in our neighborhood to sew. She said it was the one thing nobody could take from you, the work you made with your own hands. He looked at Mara's scarred knuckles again. She would have had opinions about what I'm looking at right now. Mara said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. Dante straightened. He buttoned the bottom button of his overcoat with the automatic gesture of a man who's done it 10,000 times. You'll finish the veil. You'll be paid double the commission rate. And you will come back tomorrow, and the day after, because I'm going to need someone who can keep their mouth shut and do excellent work. He paused. Mrs. Kowalski will move your station to the 3rd floor. I don't need... The 3rd floor, he said, has better locks. He left through the same door he'd come in. It closed without a sound behind him, and Mara stood alone in the gray morning light, with her ungloved hand and the blood-stained lace, and the feeling, not relief, not gratitude, but something colder and more complicated, of a door she hadn't chosen swinging shut behind her. She wrapped her left hand with the gauze from her kit. She mixed the solution for the stain, cold water, a few drops of the enzyme cleaner she'd learned about from a textile conservator in Vienna, 6 years and another entire life ago. She worked on the lace with the kind of focused attention that was also a way of not thinking. But she was thinking. She was thinking about the name she hadn't given him, Silas Crown. She was thinking about her brother Marco, 23 years old, and spectacularly bad at knowing which men to borrow money from. She was thinking about the night 8 months ago in the parking structure on West 14th, the 3 men who'd held her hands flat on the hood of a car while a 4th explained, patiently, almost kindly, what the payment schedule was going to be going forward and what the consequences of deviation would look like. She was thinking about the way Marco had cried afterward, and how that had been, somehow, the worst part of it. She was thinking about Dante Bellevere's voice when he'd said, "My mother." She finished the enzyme application and covered the treated area with a clean cloth to allow it to set. Then she picked up her needle and her thread and went back to the junction point she'd been building toward all morning, and she pushed everything else into the place in her chest where she stored things she couldn't afford to feel during working hours, and she worked. By 2 in the afternoon, the junction point was closed. Clean, invisible, structurally sound. She'd have to examine it under the magnifying glass to find the repair. By 4, she'd completed the 2nd section of separated border. By 6, with the rain still going steadily outside and the building emptying around her as the other women clocked out and headed into the wet evening, she was on the 3rd section. She didn't hear him come back. She never heard him come back, she would learn. It was something he did, entering rooms without announcing himself, as though he'd decided long ago that the element of surprise was worth more than courtesy. "You're still here," he said. Mara didn't startle. She had trained herself out of startling a long time ago. She set down her needle on the velvet roll and looked up. He had changed out of the overcoat. Dark shirt, no tie, the sleeves pushed up in a way that seemed unconscious rather than studied. He looked less like a man who owned things and more like a man who was tired. There was a slight loosening around his eyes that she recognized as the particular fatigue of someone who'd spent the day managing other people's problems. "I said end of day." She gestured at the veil. "This is end of day." He came to look at it. He stood beside her at the work table, closer than she would have chosen, and examined the repaired sections without touching them, which told her he knew something about textile work, or at least knew enough to know you didn't touch. The stain, he said. Gone. She indicated the area with the eraser end of a pencil. You can see where it was if you know exactly where to look, and you have good light. Otherwise, no. He looked at it for a long moment. My mother wore this twice, he said. Her wedding and mine. A pause. My ex-wife's, I should say. Mara didn't respond to that. Where'd you learn this? Vienna. I did a 2-year apprenticeship with a textile conservator. Museums, mostly. Old pieces. She started rolling the veil carefully onto the acid-free tube for storage. Before that, my mother. Before that, my grandmother. It goes back. How'd you end up here? The usual way. She kept her eyes on the veil. Things stopped working out the way you planned. He pulled out the chair across from her, the chair that was usually occupied by her reference materials, and sat in it, not with permission, just sat, as though the possibility of needing permission hadn't occurred to him. The debt, he said. How much? She stopped rolling the veil, looked at him. How much? He said again, not unkindly, just relentlessly. 40,000, she said. Initially. It's grown. How much has it grown? Mr. Bellevere. Dante. Mr. Bellevere. I need you to understand something. She set the tube down carefully and faced him directly, because she had learned that people took you seriously when you made them look at you. I'm not looking for a rescuer. I'm not looking for someone to take on my problems. I've been managing this situation, $40,000, and they put their hands on you. His voice was still even, which somehow made it worse. That's not you managing a situation. That's you surviving one. The accuracy of it hit her somewhere she wasn't expecting. She felt her throat tighten, and she did what she always did with that feeling. Shoved it down, locked it away, kept her face neutral. I have a plan, she said. What plan? I'm saving. I have a second job. 3 more months and I can make a payment large enough to... 3 more months of what? He leaned forward slightly, not threatening, worse than threatening, focused. 3 more months of them deciding which part of you to damage next? That's my problem. You're in my building. I work in your building. That's different. Not to me. They looked at each other across the work table with the repaired veil between them, and Mara felt the particular vertigo of a moment she couldn't quite read. Couldn't tell if she was in danger or something else that didn't have a clean name yet. Give me the name, Dante said quietly. No. Mara. It was the first time he'd used her name. It hit differently than she expected. Not warm, not intrusive, just precise, like a tool being applied to the right material. No, she said again, because I know what you do with names and I'm not going to be responsible for that. Something shifted in his face. Almost, not quite, something that could have been respect. Then let me move you, he said. Move me where? Somewhere they can't find you, you and your brother. And in exchange? He looked at her steadily. You keep working. That's all. That's all. She almost said yes. She could feel the shape of yes in her mouth, how easy it would be. She was so tired. The tiredness lived in her hands and her shoulders and behind her eyes, and in the particular way she'd learned to walk in public. Shoulders in, eyes down, take up less space, give them less to see. She was 28 years old, and she was so profoundly tired. I need to think about it, she said. He stood. Put the chair back exactly where it had been. Think fast, he said. These things have a way of moving faster than you'd like. He picked up his coat from where he'd laid it over the cutting table. At the door he paused. Not the back door this time. The regular one. The veil is extraordinary. You do work that doesn't announce itself. He said it matter-of-factly, no inflation in it. My mother would have liked you. Then he was gone. Mara sat alone in the empty garment house with the repaired veil and the rain and the locked feeling in her chest that she couldn't quite identify. She put both gloves back on, left hand first, then right. She gathered her kit, switched off the work light, and walked to the freight elevator that stuck between floors if you didn't hold the gate closed with your shoulder the whole ride down. She held it closed the whole way. Outside, the rain had softened to something almost gentle. Mara pulled her collar up and turned toward the subway and tried not to think about what she'd just turned down, about the 40,000 that had grown and grown, about Marco in the apartment on Delancey, playing video games and feeling guilty and being 23 in all the worst ways, about her hands. She made it to the end of the block before her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered, silence first, then a sound she knew, fabric moving, a small scuffling, then a voice she knew even better than her own, high with fear, trying to sound steady and failing entirely. Mare. Marco. Mare, don't. Whatever they told you to do, don't. Another voice cut over him, smooth, patient, the voice of a man who had practiced patience as a form of violence. Ms. Voss, said Silas Crown, I think it's time we had a real conversation about timelines. The rain came down. The city went on around her, indifferent and enormous. Mara stood on the wet sidewalk outside Dante Bellivere's garment house, and she understood that the 3 months she'd planned for had just become something much shorter, something, she suspected, like tonight. The phone was still warm against her ear when Mara started walking, not running. Running was what you did when panic owned you. She had learned in the particular school that scars your hands and teaches you things no classroom ever would, that running made you visible and visible got you caught. So she walked, fast, head down, shoulders pulling inward against the rain, and she listened to the sound of her brother trying not to sound afraid on the other end of a line, controlled by a man who had made patience into something predatory. Where? She said. One word, flat. Silas Crown let a beat pass before he answered. That beat was calculated. Everything about Silas Crown was calculated. The smoothness of his voice, the particular timing of his silences, the way he'd had her hand scarred in a parking structure rather than somewhere private, because public was a message, and he liked sending messages. You know the import warehouse on Hubert Street, he said. Not a question. Yes. 11 o'clock. Come alone, obviously. Come with your phone, obviously. Another pause. Come with something to write with. We're going to renegotiate. The line went quiet. Not dead. She could still hear Marco breathing, that specific ragged breathing she'd known since he was 8 years old and afraid of thunderstorms. Then Silas said something away from the phone, something she couldn't catch, and Marco made a sound that cut straight through the 28 years of her and landed somewhere ancient. Don't, she said, loud enough that people on the sidewalk turned to look. She didn't care. Don't hurt him. I'll be there. I know you will, Silas said pleasantly. You always are. The line went dead. Mara stood on the corner of Carmine and Bedford and did the only thing available to her. She breathed. In through the nose, the way she'd taught herself in the months after the parking structure, when panic attacks had come in the night like unwelcome visitors. Out through the mouth, slow, controlled. She counted the breath. She let the rain hit her face. 4 hours until 11. She turned around and walked back to the garment house. She didn't let herself think too hard about that decision. Thinking too hard was how you talked yourself out of things that needed to be done. And Mara had survived this long precisely because she'd learned when to stop deliberating and start moving. The decision had already been made, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, in the part of her that had been calculating survival for 4 years and had gotten very good at it. The freight elevator, the shoulder against the gate, the familiar knock of the mechanism engaging. 3rd floor. She hadn't been up here before. The door at the top of the shaft was different from the doors below. Heavier, steel cord, the kind of door that didn't exist in a garment house for any conventional reason. It was unlocked, which surprised her until she thought about it and decided that doors like this were for keeping things out, not in, and she was already inside. The 3rd floor was larger than she'd expected and almost entirely empty. A few pieces of covered furniture along the east wall. Good windows, the kind of high, wide windows that let in the last gray light of the evening. And a man sitting on the sill of the center window with a phone to his ear, looking out at the rain-soaked street below, who heard her step off the elevator and turned before she could speak. Dante looked at her face for approximately 1 second. Then he said into the phone, "I'll call you back," and ended the call. "Silas Crown has my brother," Mara said. She watched him absorb it, watched his face do the thing she was beginning to recognize, that particular transition from expression to something harder and more organized, like water freezing while you watched. He didn't move off the windowsill. He didn't reach for his phone again, not yet. "When did he call you?" 10 minutes ago, 15. She pressed her palms together in front of her, both gloves still on, the rain from outside still damp in her hair. "Hubert Street Warehouse, 11 tonight. He said renegotiate, which means he wants more, which means he's going to use Marco to... How long has Crown had the debt?" 4 years. And the hands were... Year 1. When Marco missed the first payment, she said it cleanly, without inflection, because that was how she'd learned to say it. To make the point. Dante got up from the windowsill. He moved across the empty floor toward her, not hurrying, and stopped about 6 feet away, which was close enough to talk at a normal volume and far enough that it wasn't a pressure move. She noted that, filed it. "Why didn't you go to the police?" "Because Marco was 19 and the man he borrowed from had a prosecutor in his pocket and 2 judges who went to his fundraisers." She looked at him directly. "And because I'd watched what happened to the last person who tried that particular exit." "What happened?" "His daughter had an accident." Dante said nothing. His jaw had that movement again, that small controlled thing that was the only outward evidence of something turning over beneath the surface. "I need to know what you want from me," Mara said. "Before I say anything else, I need to know what this costs." What costs?" "Whatever you're about to offer." He looked at her for a long moment. The building settled around them. Pipes, rain, the distant sound of traffic 7 floors below. "Nothing," he said. "It costs nothing." "That's not possible." "I'm aware it's not how you're used to people operating." His voice had a dry edge to it that wasn't quite humor. "Crown runs 3 blocks into territory that used to be civil. He's been picking at that edge for 18 months. Your brother's debt and what he did to your hands, that's not just his business. It stopped being just his business when he did it in my city." "Your city," she repeated. "My city," he said, without any particular pride in it, just the way you'd say my coat or my table. Factual. She thought about several things at once. Marco's voice on the phone. The wedding veil, repaired, lying in its tissue paper downstairs. Her left hand, which had stopped bleeding but was tightening up the way it always did in the cold. The 40,000 that had grown and grown and grown. "If you go in there tonight," she said, "people die." "Probably." "Marco dies. He'll use Marco the second." "He won't." Dante's voice was quiet. Absolute. "You can't know... I know Crown. I've known him for 11 years. He moved to one of the covered shapes along the east wall, lifted the sheet, revealed a table underneath. He put the sheet aside and leaned on the table and looked at her with the quality of attention she was learning was simply how he looked at things. Complete, nothing withheld. "Crown doesn't kill leverage, not before the meeting. He's a businessman, not a psychopath. Your brother will be fine until 11 o'clock. And after 11 o'clock? After 11 o'clock is what I'm here to fix." Mara pulled off her right glove, then her left. She looked at her hands in the gray light from the windows. The scarring across the knuckles, the particular ridge along her left ring finger where it had split open this morning and was still pulling slightly at the edges. She had not looked at her own hands like this, voluntarily, in a long time. She usually did what was necessary and looked away. "I need you to understand something," she said. "My brother is the most useless 23-year-old on the planet. He makes bad decisions with the consistency of a professional. He borrowed money from a loan shark when he was 19 because he thought he could flip it into something and he was wrong. And everything that has happened since then is the consequence of that one spectacularly stupid decision." She looked up. "I have been paying for that decision with my hands and my sleep and 4 years of my life. I am telling you this clearly. I am not going to be responsible for what you do to fix it." Dante met her eyes. "Okay." "Okay?" she repeated. "That's all you have to say." "What did you want me to say?" She put her gloves back on. I want you to tell me your men don't go in until Marco is out of that building. Done. I want your word. He looked at her with that expression she couldn't fully catalog, the one that lived between respect and something more complicated. You have it, Mara nodded once. A short, precise nod, the kind that closed a negotiation. She moved toward the elevator. Where are you going? He said. Home. I need to change clothes, and I need to think, and I need to not be in this building for the next 3 hours. She reached the elevator and put her shoulder against the gate. Your men need to be in position by 10:15, not 10:30, 10:15. Why 10:15? Because Silas Crown always arrives early to places he controls. He'll be there by 10:45. If your people aren't already in position, he'll see them moving into place, and Marco becomes a... She stopped. Just 10:15. Dante was quiet for a moment. How do you know he arrives early? Because I've been to 3 of these meetings, she said, and I've paid attention every time. The elevator descended. The building fell away above her, floor by floor. Outside, the rain had picked up again. Mara walked to the subway with her hands in her pockets and her face down, and her mind doing the thing she relied on when everything else failed. Cataloging, organizing, sorting the variables into columns. What she could control, what she couldn't. Marco fell firmly in the second column. He always had. She loved him with the particular exhausted ferocity of someone who has spent years cleaning up after a person and cannot stop. She had tried once, 2 years ago. Tried to walk away. Tried to tell him that she had done everything she could and it wasn't enough and he needed to find his own way. She'd made it 9 days before he called from a hospital. Nothing serious, a bad fall. But the sound of his voice on that call had undone the 9 days in about 30 seconds. And she'd taken a cab across 4 boroughs in the rain and sat with him in the emergency room for 6 hours, not saying a word, and he hadn't said sorry, which was the thing about Marco. He never quite said sorry. He just looked at her with those eyes that were so much like their mother's that it was almost cruel. And that was worse than sorry. That was unanswerable. She was thinking about this on the subway platform, waiting for the F train, when her phone buzzed again. Different unknown number. She answered immediately. You went back to the building. A man's voice, not Silas. Someone else, someone with a Brooklyn accent and a careful quality to his consonants. Mr. Crown would like you to know that he's aware of that. Mara's stomach dropped. She kept her face still. Good for him. We know whose building it is, Ms. Voss. We know whose commission you were working on tonight. I'm a seamstress, she said. I work for people who pay me. Right. A pause that had something ugly in it. Mr. Crown wants you to think very carefully about who you bring into this conversation. Very carefully. He wants you to think about your brother's fingers specifically. She closed her eyes for 3 full seconds, opened them. Tell your employer I'll be at Hubert Street at 11. And Bellevere? Tell your employer I'm a seamstress. I work for people who pay me. She ended the call before they could. The F train arrived in a gust of tunnel air, and she got on and stood holding the overhead bar with both gloved hands and looked at her own reflection in the dark window across from her, small, pale, damp, and had a conversation with herself that lasted the entire ride to Delancey Street. By the time she got off, the conversation was finished. She had lost it. The apartment was what it always was, a 2-bedroom on the 4th floor of a building that had good bones and bad maintenance, the walls thin enough to hear the couple next door's entire emotional life, the radiator that worked too hard from October to March, and not at all in April. Marco's side was predictably wrecked, dishes in the sink, 3 different game controllers tangled on the couch, a stack of job listings he'd printed out 2 months ago and had not looked at since. Mara's side was the opposite, bed made with hospital corners. Kit organized on the shelf above her work table, the small framed photograph of their mother, young in it, laughing at something outside the frame, hands gesturing the way she always did when she was telling a story, on the dresser. Mara changed out of her wet clothes. She sat on the edge of her bed for a few minutes in dry clothes and looked at her mother's photograph. Then she got up and went to the work table. In the bottom drawer under a roll of muslin she used for mock-ups was a metal box. Inside the box were things she had been collecting for 14 months, carefully. The way you collected evidence when you couldn't go to the police and you needed something that could go somewhere else instead. Receipts with Silas Crown's fingerprints on them. Not literally, but traceable to his operation through 3 shell companies she'd spent hours mapping on graph paper. Photographs she'd taken on her phone of meetings she'd been made to attend, faces she'd memorized and researched in public records afterward, 2 ledger pages she'd photographed through a window when Silas's accountant had left them visible on a desk. She'd been there to make a payment, had been made to wait, and she had always paid attention. She spread it all on the work table and looked at it. 14 months of careful, quiet, patient work. It wasn't enough to hand to a prosecutor. She'd consulted, obliquely, anonymously, with a legal aid clinic, and they'd told her as much. It wasn't nothing either. It was the shape of something, the outline of something that could become enough, given time. Time she apparently no longer had. She thought about what Dante had said. After 11 o'clock is what I'm here to fix. She thought about the way he'd given her his word with no hesitation, no negotiation, no conditions attached. She thought about the call from Crown's man. We know whose building it is. If she went to Hubert Street tonight and Dante's people were waiting and it went the way Dante clearly intended it to go, Crown would be finished, Marco would be free, and she would walk out of a warehouse on the Lower West Side into a world where Dante Bellevere had just done her an enormous favor. Mara knew what enormous favors felt like from the inside. She'd spent 4 years inside one that had started as a loan. She put the evidence back in the box. She sat with her hands in her lap and thought for a long time. Then she took everything back out. She was still at the work table at 9:15 when her phone buzzed. A text this time. Unknown number, but she knew the cadence of it immediately. Short, no punctuation, the kind of text sent by someone who communicated in facts and found everything else inefficient. Car outside. Use it or don't. She looked at it for a moment, looked at her work table, looked at the photograph of her mother, laughing at something outside the frame. She put the evidence in her bag. The metal box was too conspicuous, so she took everything out of it and put it in a padded envelope from the supplies shelf, the kind she used to ship delicate pieces to clients. She sealed it. She thought for a moment and then wrote, on the outside in her clearest handwriting, an address. A law office in Midtown she'd researched 8 months ago. A firm that had successfully prosecuted 2 organized crime cases in the last 5 years, and that had a reputation for protecting witnesses. She didn't have enough for them. Not yet. She put the envelope in her bag alongside the other things. Then she went downstairs to the car. It was a dark sedan, idling at the curb. The driver was a man about 50 with a face like a closed fist, who looked at her in the rear view and didn't say anything and pulled into traffic when she closed the door. They didn't go to the warehouse. They went to a building in Tribeca that had a lobby so understated it was nearly offensive, and a doorman who moved like a man who'd worked other jobs before this one. 12th floor. A door that opened before she knocked. Dante's apartment was large and almost surprisingly spare, not minimalist in the designed way, but in the way of someone who'd gotten rid of things over the years and hadn't replaced them because the things hadn't mattered. Good furniture, worn to comfort. Books stacked rather than shelved. A kitchen that looked used. On the wall near the window, a single framed piece. A photograph, old, black and white. A woman at a sewing machine, her face turned slightly toward the camera with an expression of interrupted focus. His mother. Mara knew it without being told. There were 2 other men in the room, one she'd seen before. Not to speak to, but she knew his face. A man named Caruso, who had the quiet physicality of someone who solved problems that required physicality. The other was younger, with glasses and a laptop, and the look of a person who existed in the same world as the others but had arrived by a completely different route. Dante stood at the kitchen counter with a glass of water. He looked at her bag. You brought something, he said. 14 months of something. She set the bag down on the table near the door. It's not enough for a prosecution, but it's enough to pull certain threads and see what unravels. He looked at the bag for a moment, then at her. You've been building a case. I've been collecting things, in case I ever needed them. She paused. I need them. The young man with the glasses, she learned later his name was Eli, that he had a finance degree and a criminal record that Dante had expunged 4 years ago, and a loyalty that came from genuine debt rather than fear. Eli opened his laptop and looked at her. What do you have? he said. She told him. The next hour and a half was the most focused she'd been since the early days of her Vienna apprenticeship. That quality of concentration where the thing you're examining fills your entire field of vision and everything else drops away. They spread her documents across the table. Eli photographed each one with his phone and ran them through something on his laptop that she didn't ask about. He and Dante talked over her head occasionally, short exchanges, names and numbers she didn't have context for. And she paid attention to those too, filing them, because Mara Voss had survived 4 years by paying attention to everything. At 10:10, Caruso left. He did it without announcement, just stood up from where he'd been leaning against the wall for the last 90 minutes, checked something on his phone, and walked out. 10:15, Mara thought. Your men need to be in position by 10:15. Dante noticed her notice. He knows, he said simply. Eli closed his laptop. He gave Dante a look that contained a whole conversation in it, received a single nod in return, and left as well. The apartment got very quiet. I'm going to the warehouse, Mara said. No. Silas is expecting me. If I don't show, my people are already in position. They don't need you there. Your people? She stood up from the table. Dante, if I don't show, he knows something's wrong, and the first thing he does when something goes wrong is, I know what he does. Then you know I need to be there. He turned from the window. His face had that quality again, the closed winter water quality. But there was something else in it tonight, something she was seeing for the first time, something that looked almost like the very early stages of fear. Not for himself. She was fairly sure, looking at him, that Dante Bellevere had conducted a complex renegotiation with his own fear sometime in the past and arrived at a separate peace. This was different. This was the fear you feel for something outside yourself. She filed that away too. If you walk into that building, he said, I cannot guarantee your safety from the outside. I know. Mara. I know. She picked up her bag. But Marco is already inside. Something shifted in his face. The thing she'd been watching move under the surface all evening finally broke through for just a moment before he pulled it back under. He crossed to the kitchen counter and picked up his phone and said something into it in Italian, low and rapid, that she didn't catch. Then he put the phone down and looked at her. You go in, you get your brother, you stay near the north wall. There's a fire exit 30 feet along it. He said it the way people recite things they've already planned. When you hear a car alarm, Shipdates, any car alarm, the first one you hear, you move to that exit and you go through it. You do not stop. You do not look back. Are we clear? Yes. I need to hear that you understand. I understand. He held her eyes. She held his. In the middle of all of it, the warehouse and Silas Crown and Marco's ragged phone breathing and 14 months of evidence spread across a Tribeca apartment table, she was aware, with the peripheral clarity of extreme stress, that this man had spent the last 4 hours treating her like someone whose judgment he trusted. Not someone to be managed, not someone to be protected from a safe distance, someone whose read on the situation he was factoring in, adjusting around, building his plans to accommodate. She didn't have the time or the emotional reserve to know what to do with that. She put it in the chest with everything else. Car alarm, she said. North wall. Fire exit. Go. She went. The sedan was still outside. The same driver, same closed fist face, same silence. They took the West Side Highway south, and the city streamed past the window, lit up and indifferent and beautiful in the way New York was always beautiful to her, which was to say, not pretty, not gentle, but so thoroughly and completely itself that it became something else on the other side of scale. She watched it go past and held her bag in her lap and thought about her mother, who had never been to New York, who had sewed in a small house outside of Stuttgart and taught Mara to sew at a kitchen table, and had died of a very ordinary illness when Mara was 19 and Marco was 15, and the world had rearranged itself around that absence into a shape neither of them had ever fully adjusted to. That was the real story under the story, the thing that had never gotten said. Marco's bad decision at 19 wasn't only about money or stupidity, it was about a 15-year-old who'd lost the thing that kept him tethered and had spent the years since testing the tension on every rope he grabbed hold of to see if it would hold, Sometimes she understood this with great clarity. Sometimes she was just furious at him. Right now, in the sedan on the West Side Highway, she was both simultaneously, which was usually where she lived. The warehouse on Hubert Street was a converted shipping building from the 1940s. Enormous, brick, with a loading dock that faced the water and a secondary entrance on the street side that looked like a fire door, but wasn't alarmed if you knew which panel to press. Mara knew, because she'd been here twice before. She got out of the car at the corner. The driver didn't say anything. She didn't either. The rain had stopped while she was in Tribeca. The streets were wet and gleaming and empty in the way industrial streets went empty after dark. Completely, without apology. The kind of empty that made you aware of how much the usual human density was actually doing for your sense of safety. She pressed the panel. The door opened. Inside was the smell of old concrete and river damp, and something chemical underneath that had probably been there since the building's original purpose. The space was enormous and mostly dark. Overhead lights at the far end where the dock was, casting a yellow industrial glow over a cluster of people that Mara clocked immediately and efficiently. 4 men she didn't know, 1 she did, and Marco. Marco was sitting in a chair that had been placed in the middle of the floor with the deliberate staging of someone making a point. He was not tied. Another point, the point being that restraints were unnecessary because you already understood your position. His hands were in his lap, and he was looking at the floor. And when Mara stepped into the light and he looked up and saw her, something crossed his face that she had learned to hate over the years, because it was always the same thing. Relief. Pure, uncomplicated. She's here. It's going to be okay relief. The problem with being someone's safe harbor was that it required you to be stronger than you actually were, every single time. "Mare," Marco said. "Hi." She kept walking, stopped 6 feet from his chair, looked at him, the split lip that hadn't been there this morning, the way he was holding his left arm slightly wrong. She looked at Silas Crown. He was leaning against a support column with his arms crossed and his expression pleasant, which was the expression he wore when he wanted to remind you that pleasantness, for him, was a choice. He was 50-something, compact, with silver hair and the groomed look of a man who'd worked very hard to appear reasonable. He wore it the way some men wore weapons, openly, to make a point. "Ms. Voss," he said, "you're punctual, as always. You have my brother." "I have your brother," he agreed pleasantly. "How was your evening? I understand you were working late." He tilted his head. "Private commission. Very upscale client." Mara said nothing. "The thing about working for certain kinds of clients," Silas said, and began to walk toward her in that unhurried way that was designed to make you want to step back, is that it implies certain kinds of relationships, and certain kinds of relationships imply certain kinds of loyalties, and certain kinds of loyalties— He stopped 2 feet from her. "Are very interesting information in the right context." "I'm a seamstress," Mara said. "I work for people who pay me." "The 3rd time you've said that tonight." His smile went thin. It's losing texture. One of the men she didn't know moved in her peripheral vision. She tracked him without turning her head. "Tell me what you want," she said. "The real number." "The real number." Silas seemed to find this charming. "All right. The real number is this. Your brother's debt, plus 4 years of accumulated interest at the rate we discussed, plus a consideration fee for tonight's inconvenience. Call it $120,000. He watched her face. "Or." She waited. "Or," he said, "you tell me everything you know about Dante Bellivere's current operation. Specifically, the accounts. Specifically, the garment house and whatever it's actually used for." He smiled again. "That buys your brother. Clean. No number. Done." The warehouse settled around them. Somewhere near the dock, water dripped steadily on concrete. Marco had gone very still in his chair. Mara thought about the padded envelope in her bag. She thought about the car alarm. Any car alarm, the first one you hear. She thought about 10:15 and whether Caruso's people were where they were supposed to be. She thought about her mother at her sewing machine, face turned slightly toward the camera, expression of interrupted focus. "I want to see that my brother can walk," she said. Silas gestured. One of the men nudged Marco's chair. Marco stood, slowly, favoring his left side. Ribs, she thought, something with the ribs. But he stood, and he walked 4 steps and stopped and looked at her. He was okay. Hurt, but okay. She cataloged the hurt and stored it. Satisfied? Silas said. Mara reached into her bag. Every man in the room shifted at that. She felt it. The collective physical attention, the way bodies ready themselves. And she moved slowly, deliberately, so they could see what she was reaching for. She pulled out the padded envelope. Silas looked at it. "What is that?" he said, and for the first time since she'd walked through the fire door, the pleasantness in his voice had something under it, something that wasn't pleasant. 14 months, Mara said, of paying attention. She held it out. He didn't take it immediately, just looked at it with that something under the pleasantness, calculating, trying to read the play. "That's a copy," she said. "The original is already somewhere you can't reach it." The lie was clean. She'd had 11 months in this building and 4 years in this situation to learn how to tell the kind of lie that sits still and doesn't move when you poke it. Silas took the envelope, opened it. She watched his face as he looked at the first document, and what she saw there was worth the 14 months. Fear. Small, quickly controlled, but real. He was afraid of what she had. He should be. He looked up at her with the pleasantness entirely gone now, and something else in its place. Something that had been under the pleasant the whole time and was not pleasant at all. "You've been busy," he said. "I'm good at paying attention," she said. "It's the same skill as sewing, really. You look at the thing in front of you until you understand exactly how it's made." Silas was quiet for 5 seconds. 10. She counted them. Outside on Hubert Street, the night was perfectly silent. Then a car alarm went off. Mara had spent 4 years making herself small and still and unnoticeable. She had spent 4 years practicing the art of the controlled response, the face that showed nothing, the body that telegraphed nothing. But in the half-second between the sound of that car alarm and her first step toward the north wall, all of that practice showed its seams, because her body knew, before she finished the conscious thought, exactly what that sound meant, and exactly where she needed to be. She grabbed Marco's arm. "Hey," he started. "North wall," she said. "Now." And the warehouse stopped being quiet. The first sound was the dock doors, both of them simultaneously, with the percussive crack of a forced entry done by people who'd done it before. Then the side entrance behind her. Then lights. Real lights, not the yellow industrial glow. White and absolute and coming from everywhere, killing every shadow in the building in under 2 seconds. Silas Crown turned toward the dock. His men turned with him, hands moving to places where hands moved in moments like this. And in the confusion and the light and the noise, Mara put herself between Marco and the center of the room and moved him toward the north wall as fast as his ribs allowed. She counted the steps. 20, 25. Her hand on the push bar of the fire exit. Cold metal, real, the most solid thing she'd touched all night. She pushed through with Marco and they came out into an alley and the wet pavement smell of after rain and the sound of Hubert Street going suddenly and completely chaotic behind them. Marco was breathing in short pulls. "What? Who?" "Don't stop," she said. "Mara, what did you—" "Marco." She stopped and turned and took his face in both her hands. Gloves off now, both hands, scars against his cheeks, and looked at him in the dark alley with the noise from the warehouse building behind them. "I need you to not ask me anything right now. I need you to walk and not look back. Can you do that?" He looked at her. 19-year-old Marco making a bad decision. 15-year-old Marco at a hospital. Every single time, that face. Their mother's eyes, their father's stubborn jaw, asking her to be stronger than she was. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, okay." They walked. But the envelope was still inside the warehouse, and Silas Crown still had it, and as they turned onto Hubert Street and the lights of the city received them back, Mara understood something that hadn't fully landed until this moment. She had given Silas 14 months of evidence that implicated not just his operation, but in the margins, in the shell company tracings, in 2 of the photographs she'd included, evidence that touched Dante Bellivere's accounts as well. She had not meant to do that. She had not seen it. In her careful cataloging, in the months of quiet assembly. But Silas Crown had seen it in 30 seconds, and now he had it. She stopped walking. Marco walked 2 more steps before he noticed and turned back. "What?" he said. Mara stood on the wet sidewalk outside the warehouse with the sounds of whatever was happening inside still coming through the walls, and she understood, with the particular clarity of a person who has just made an irreversible error, that she had not come here tonight with a weapon. She had come here tonight and handed one to the wrong man. She stood there for 4 seconds, maybe 5, long enough for Marco to say her name twice and for the sounds from inside the warehouse to shift from chaotic to something more organized and therefore more final. Then she turned around and walked back toward the fire exit. "Mara." Marco grabbed her arm with his good hand. "Mara, what are you doing?" "Let go. There are people in there with—" "I know what's in there." She stopped and looked at him with the particular flatness she'd developed over 4 years of making decisions he didn't understand and couldn't afford to question. "Go to the end of the block. There's a dark sedan, Jack. Driver won't speak to you, but he'll let you in. Get in and stay there." "I'm not leaving you. Marco." She said it the way their mother used to say it. Not loud, not mean, just final. In the way that certain voices in certain moments are simply final, and arguing with them is arguing with gravity. "Get in the car." He let go of her arm. He looked at her with their mother's eyes for 1 more second, and then he went. Mara pushed back through the fire exit. The warehouse had reorganized itself in the time she'd been outside. Dante's men, 6 of them that she could see, almost certainly more she couldn't, had the dock end of the building contained. Silas's people were not fighting, which told her something about the relative weights in the room, about what Silas had calculated in the 30 seconds between the car alarm and the doors coming in. The 4 men she hadn't recognized were against the east wall with their hands visible, doing the arithmetic of the situation and arriving at the right answer. Silas himself was standing in the center of the floor exactly where she'd left him. He still had the envelope. He had it held against his chest with one hand, almost protectively, the way you'd hold something you'd decided was valuable. He was talking to Caruso in the low, reasonable voice of a man conducting a business meeting under unusual circumstances. And when Mara came back through the fire exit, he stopped talking and looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Satisfaction. Not the performed kind. The real kind. That was wrong. That was all wrong. He should be afraid. She crossed the floor toward him, and Caruso stepped into her path without aggression, just presence. Just the body language of a man who had been told to manage a perimeter and was doing so. "I need to get that envelope back," she said to Caruso. "Ms. Voss," Silas's voice from behind Caruso. "Don't embarrass yourself." Caruso looked at her with a face that communicated nothing and gave nothing, and then looked past her left shoulder at something, and Mara turned. Dante had come in through the dock doors. He came in the way he came into every room, without announcement, without theater, rearranging the space simply by occupying it. He looked at the warehouse, at his men, at Silas Crown's people against the east wall, at Caruso, at Mara. He did all of this in about 3 seconds. Then he looked at the envelope in Silas's hand. "What is that?" he said. Not to Silas, to Mara. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, and said, "I can explain what it is." "What is it?" "It's the evidence I've been collecting. 14 months, hey? I told you about it in your apartment. I spread it on the—" "Why does he have it?" "Because I made a mistake." The words were flat and accurate, and they cost her something she couldn't name. "I brought it here to use as leverage, and I didn't think through. There are documents in there that touch your accounts, Dante. Not directly. 3 layers through shell companies. I didn't see it when I was assembling it. I was looking at his operation, not yours, and I—" "She's been very thorough," Silas said pleasantly, from behind Caruso. "Thorough enough to make certain things very difficult for you, Dante. If this material found its way to certain people." He tilted his head. "Which it will. Unless we have a different kind of conversation than the one you clearly came here to have." The warehouse went very still. Dante looked at Silas Crown for a long moment. His face was the face she'd seen across the work table that morning. Closed, winter cold, the face of a man conducting internal calculations at a speed you couldn't follow from the outside. Then he looked at Mara again, and she felt the weight of that look in a different place than she was used to being looked at. "How much of my operation is in there?" he said. "Enough," Silas answered for her. "Enough to make the accounts on West Street very interesting to people who've been watching those accounts for a while." He smiled. "Your seamstress is talented. Pity she doesn't look at everything she makes." The worst part was not that Silas had said it. The worst part was that Dante didn't contradict him. Mara watched Dante's face for something. A denial, a qualification, the particular look of a man being lied about by someone who stood to gain from the lie. She watched for it carefully because she was good at watching carefully, because 4 years had made her into an instrument calibrated for exactly this kind of reading. She didn't find it. What she found instead was a man looking at her with something that lived right next to regret. "Get her out of here," Dante said to Caruso. "No!" Mara stepped around Caruso. She stepped far enough around him that she was in Dante's direct line of sight with nothing between them. "Tell me what's on West Street." Mara, tell me." Her voice didn't shake. She had promised herself a long time ago that she would not be a woman whose voice shook when she needed it to be steady. "Tell me right now what I accidentally documented, because I have a right to know what I've been standing in the middle of for the last 11 months. Dante was quiet for a very long moment. Around them, the warehouse was suspended. Men on both sides of a line that hadn't quite been drawn yet, watching two people in the center of a concrete floor sort out something that wasn't, and had never been, about Silas Crown. "The garment house moves money," Dante said. "Has for 6 years. Clean money in, different money out." He said it simply, without apology, without decoration. "The women who work there make clothes. That's real. The work is real. But the accounts are not real. The accounts are complicated." Mara took a breath. Let it out. Took another one. "I've been working in a laundry," she said. "You've been working in a garment house." "Don't." The word came out sharp enough that even Silas, 10 feet behind her, went quiet. "Don't manage this right now. Don't give me the version where I'm supposed to feel better about it. I've been in your building for 11 months and I've been sitting in the middle of your—" She stopped, controlled it. "Mrs. Kowalski, does she know?" A beat. "Yes." "The other women?" "No." "So they're—" She stopped again, harder this time. "They're cover. They think they're going to work every morning and they're cover. They have real jobs. They get paid real wages. And meanwhile," she looked at him, "meanwhile." Dante met her eyes. He didn't look away. She'd give him that. He had whatever it took to look at the thing he'd done and not flinch, which was either a quality she should admire or the most troubling thing she'd learned about him yet, and she genuinely couldn't tell which. "This is a lovely reunion," Silas said, "but I think we should talk about what happens next." Nobody responded to him for a moment. Mara and Dante looked at each other across a distance of 4 feet and 11 months, and Mara felt something she'd been building without quite knowing she was building it develop a crack. Then she turned to Silas. "What do you want?" she said. "I want out of the corner your friend put me in 6 months ago," Silas said. "The block dispute, the territory. I want it resolved in my favor, officially, with documentation. And I want those accounts, the West Street situation, left alone. No escalation, no ongoing pressure." He looked at Dante. "In exchange for which, this envelope disappears, and Ms. Voss and her brother go on their way, and we never have to spend an evening in a warehouse again." "And the debt," Mara said. Silas looked at her. "What about it?" "My brother's debt, the original 40,000, it's gone." It's gone," she said. "Or I call the legal aid number I have saved in my phone right now, and I tell them exactly where to look and what they'll find, and I do it before you or anyone in this room can stop me." She took out her phone, held it up. "I photographed everything before I put it in that envelope, including the pages that touch Dante's accounts, which I didn't see when I put it together, but I can certainly describe to the right person in enough detail to be useful." Silas looked at the phone. He looked at her face. He was looking for the bluff, and she let him look, because the thing about a bluff that was also partially true was that it had a different quality than a pure fiction, and she had learned how to let that quality show. She hadn't photographed the documents after she'd packed the envelope. She'd been in too much of a hurry, but she had photographed most of them in the 14 months of assembling them, and she did have a number saved. "Debt's gone," Silas said. His pleasantness had taken on a different quality and thinner, more effortful. "Fine. Yes." Mara looked at Dante. Dante looked at Silas for a long moment. Something passed over his face, not agreement exactly, more like the expression of a man swallowing something that didn't go down easily. "West Street is done," he said. "As of tonight." Silas nodded once. He held out the envelope toward Mara. She took it. She tucked it back in her bag without looking at it. She was aware, distantly, that her hands were completely steady, which struck her as either impressive or the result of having moved past the threshold where fear registers in the body. "Are we finished?" Dante said to Silas. "We're finished," Silas said. His eyes moved to Mara one more time, something in them. She catalogued it, filed it, didn't let herself examine it yet. "Ms. Voss, you are, genuinely, the most dangerous person I've dealt with all year, and I mean that without a single bit of warmth." Mara didn't respond. She walked to the fire exit, and she went through it, and she stood in the alley, and she breathed. In through the nose, 4 counts, out through the mouth, 4 counts. She did this 6 times. Then she went to find Marco. He was in the sedan. The driver had let him in exactly as she'd said, and he was sitting in the back seat with his arms crossed and his face doing the complicated thing it did when he was frightened and trying to cover it with attitude. He looked at her when she got in, and then he looked at her bag, and then he looked at her face, and he didn't ask anything, which was, she would think about this later, probably the most mature thing he'd done in 4 years. "Hospital," she said to the driver. "I don't need—" Marco started. "Your arm is wrong, and I think your ribs." She looked at him. "Hospital." He subsided. They went to Lenox Hill because it was far enough from Hubert Street to feel like a different story. She sat with Marco in the emergency waiting room for 3 hours while they x-rayed 2 cracked ribs and the hairline fracture in his left wrist, which was worse than the arm she'd thought, and which meant someone had done something specific to produce it. She sat with him through the doctor's questions, which Marco answered with the particular skill of a person who'd been answering doctors' questions about injuries for 4 years. She watched the nurse wrap his wrist and tape his ribs and listened to the instructions about rest and follow-up, and didn't absorb any of it because her mind was somewhere else entirely. It was in the warehouse, in the moment when she'd watched Dante's face looking for a denial and not finding one. The garment house moves money. 11 months. She had gotten there 8 weeks after the parking structure on West 14th because a woman at the legal aid clinic had mentioned that there was a garment house uptown that needed skilled workers, good pay, no questions asked about history. The no questions asked part was what had mattered to her then. She'd been wrong about what kind of no questions asked it was, or had she? She turned this over in the hospital waiting room while Marco dozed against her shoulder and the fluorescent lights did their merciless work on everyone in the room. She had been hired knowing nothing. She had been given work that was real. The veil, tonight, was real, was beautiful, was the most difficult and satisfying restoration she'd done in years. The women at the cutting tables were real. Mrs. Kowalski's implacable morning discipline was real. The thing under it, the accounts, the money moving through like a river under ice, she hadn't known. She hadn't known. And Dante had known she hadn't known. You do work that doesn't announce itself. My mother would have liked you. She pressed her knuckles against her mouth. Both hands, scarred skin against her lips. She sat with that for a long moment, and then she took her hands down and looked at them in the hospital light and thought about the veil. The veil was still in the garment house, in its tissue paper on the shelf she'd put it on before she left. The repairs were finished. She told him it would be done by end of day, and it was done. His mother had worn it twice. His marriage had apparently not survived. She thought about the wedding veil. She thought about 14 months of evidence. She thought about something else. Something that had been sitting in the back of her mind since the warehouse, filing itself quietly while the rest of her was occupied with crisis management. Something Silas had said that she'd heard and registered and not examined yet. She's been very thorough. Thorough enough to make certain things very difficult for you, Dante, if this material found its way to certain people. Which it will. unless we have a different kind of conversation. She'd taken that as a threat, the standard shape of a Silas Crown ultimatum, territory she knew how to navigate. But sitting in the hospital waiting room at 1:15 in the morning, she turned it over and looked at its underside and found something she hadn't looked at before. Silas had been afraid. Not of Dante's men, not of Caruso. He had been afraid of the envelope. Before Dante had walked through the dock doors, in those 30 seconds between the car alarm and the arrival of people with the kind of presence that made you revise your plans. Silas Crown had looked at her documents and had been afraid, which meant there was something in there that she hadn't fully understood yet. She didn't have the documents with her. The envelope was in her bag. She'd had them spread across her work table for weeks. But looking at them in isolation, looking at each piece in the context of Silas's operation, she had never looked at all of them together and asked the question, what is the worst thing here? Not worse for me. What is the worst thing from the perspective of someone who needs this to stay buried? She needed to go back to the work table. She needed to go back to the garment house. She needed to not do either of those things tonight, because it was 1 in the morning and Marco had cracked ribs, and she had been running on adrenaline for 6 hours, and the particular clarity that adrenaline produces was going to fall off a cliff soon, and she knew what she was like on the other side of that cliff. She made herself sit still until Marco's discharge paperwork came through. She took him home. She made him take the painkillers the hospital had prescribed. She made him drink a full glass of water and eat 2 slices of bread because she knew from experience that painkillers on an empty stomach produced a misery that would wake her up at 3 in the morning. She got him settled on the couch rather than his bedroom because the bedroom required him to navigate his mattress, which was on the floor because he'd never gotten around to buying a frame, and cracked ribs and a floor mattress were a bad equation. "Mare," he said, half asleep, as she was getting her coat. "Sleep." "I'm sorry." He said it to the ceiling, not performing it, not building towards something else, just the 2 words, spare and plain. "I know I say it, and then I keep—" He stopped. "I know." She stood in the doorway of the living room and looked at him, 23 years old, their mother's eyes, a bruised face and taped ribs and a wrist in a brace. She thought about all the ways she'd almost lost him over 4 years, and all the ways she'd run toward every one of those moments with her scars and her exhaustion and her absolute incapacity to let him go. "I know you know," she said. "Sleep." She went. Outside on Delancey Street at 2 in the morning, the city was doing its overnight version of itself. Garbage trucks, the groan of the M train overhead, a cluster of people outside a bar 2 blocks up, a man with a grocery cart of cans moving steadily along the gutter with the purposeful efficiency of someone who'd made a career of it. Mara stood on the sidewalk in the yellow-orange dark and felt the adrenaline begin its promised collapse. First in her knees, a slight liquid feeling, then in her shoulders, which dropped about an inch when she stopped holding them up deliberately. Her phone buzzed. She took it out. Dante. She looked at his name on the screen for 5 full seconds. Then she answered. "Your brother," he said. 2 cracked ribs. Hairline wrist fracture. He'll be fine. A pause. "Where are you?" "Delancey Street." "Go home." "I was about to." She paused. Looked at the phone screen for a moment, then back at the street. "The West Street accounts. You said done. Tonight." "Yes." "What does that mean, actually? What does done look like?" "It means what I said it means." "Dante." She said his name the way he'd said hers the first time. Not warm, not cold, just precise. A tool applied to the right material. "I need to know whether I'm standing in the same place tomorrow morning or a different one." The line was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had a different quality. Not softer, but somehow less armored. The quality of a man who'd taken something off to make space for a different kind of conversation. "The garment house is clean," he said. "Has been for 11 months." She went very still on the sidewalk. "When I started this arrangement," he said, when I met with Kowalski about reorganizing the accounts, 11 months ago." Another pause. "I was already planning to move things out. Had been planning it for a while. The commission from you—" The timing was. It wasn't planned, but the building was already moving toward clean. So when I started working there, the accounts were already being restructured. What's in your documents is 12 to 18 months old. Mara stood very still. The garbage truck ground past. The M train overhead announced itself and departed. You should have told me, she said. You had enough to carry. That is not your decision. No, he said. It's not. No qualification, no pivot. Just, it's not, and I made it anyway, and I know what that is. Mara closed her eyes. The backs of her eyelids were orange from the streetlight, and in that orange dark she ran through the last 11 months with this new information laid over them like a transparency. The good locks on the third floor, the double commission rate, the way he'd spoken about his mother's hands, all of it lit differently by what she now understood about the timing. What are you going to do about Crown? She said. That's not your... It is, she said, because my documents are the only reason he walked out of that warehouse, and if they disappear, if you make them disappear as part of whatever comes next, then he has nothing to be afraid of, and my brother is back to carrying a debt that's supposed to be gone. Her voice was steady. She needed it steady. So I'm asking what you're going to do about Crown. A longer pause than the others. He'll honor what he agreed to, Dante said, until he finds a reason not to. And then it's handled. That's not an answer. It's the answer I have right now. She opened her eyes. The street was still the street, unchanged and uncaring, and she was standing on it in the middle of the night after a day that had started with a bloodstain on Venetian lace and had arrived here. The veil is finished, she said. It's on the shelf in the third-floor workroom. I know. I'll come in tomorrow. She heard him start to say something and kept going. Not for you. Not because of tonight. I'll come in because Mrs. Kowalski has 3 pieces waiting and they're my work, and I don't leave work unfinished. She paused. But I need you to understand something. When I come back, I need every door in that building to be exactly what it appears to be. If I open a door and there's something behind it I didn't agree to be part of, I leave, and I take every copy of everything I have with me. Understood. Your word. You have it. She ended the call. She walked home. She went to the work table before she went to bed, because the work table was where she went when she needed to think without the noise of the rest of her life getting in the way. She took the envelope out of her bag and set it in front of her and looked at it for a long time without opening it. Then she opened it. She spread the documents out. 14 months of her own careful, quiet work. She looked at all of it together, which she hadn't done since the early stages of assembly, when the whole had been too unwieldy and she'd moved to examining pieces. She was looking for the thing that had frightened Silas Crown. She was not a financial expert. She was a woman who had worked on old fabric and learned to read the structure of things, to look at how something was made at a level below the visible. She had applied this to Silas's operation because it was the skill she had and the materials she was working with, and she had been thorough, and she had been patient, and she had assembled something real. She looked at it for 2 hours. At 4 in the morning, she found it. It wasn't in the receipts. It wasn't in the photographs. It was in one of the 2 ledger pages she'd photographed through the window while waiting to make a payment 14 months ago. The ones she'd almost not included because she wasn't sure they were legible enough to be useful. They were legible. In the lower right column of the second page, in figures small enough that she'd looked at them before without registering their significance, was a series of transactions she now understood differently than she had when she'd first photographed them. Then, she'd thought they represented money moving through Silas's accounts in the ordinary way of his operation. Now, having spent 2 hours looking at everything together, having traced the pattern backward from the shell companies she'd mapped on graph paper, she understood what those transactions actually were. Not Silas's money moving through Silas's accounts. Other people's money. Specific people. People whose names were in coded form, but decipherable form if you looked at it the right way, attached to those figures. People who had been at a high society gala 18 months ago. People who were the kind of people whose presence at a gala made it high society. People who could not afford, professionally, legally, personally, to have their names attached to Silas Crown's operation. People, some of them, whose names she recognized. She sat at her work table at 4 in the morning and looked at what she had built without understanding she was building it, and felt a particular kind of cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. Silas Crown wasn't just running a street operation. He had been for 20 years. What he had spent those 20 years building, what these ledger pages were the paper trail of, was leverage. Over people who mattered, over people whose mattering was the thing that made the leverage worth having. This was not 14 months of evidence against a loan shark. This was a map of the city's most careful secrets, and she had almost given it to him voluntarily, standing in a warehouse on Hubert Street, because she had not understood what she was carrying. She pressed both hands flat on the table and stared at the ledger pages and thought, who else knows this exists? Silas knew. He'd looked at it for 30 seconds and known immediately. Dante. Dante's people had looked at her documents in his Tribeca apartment. Eli had photographed everything, which meant Dante might know, or might know by morning. She thought about the gala. She thought about the names on the ledger pages. She thought about the fact that Silas Crown, who had spent 20 years building this particular architecture of leverage, had tonight, in a warehouse, outnumbered, under lights, calmly renegotiated rather than fighting. Because the ledger pages made him untouchable. Because the people whose secrets lived in them were exactly the people Dante could not afford to have looking in his direction. Because Silas had known, the moment he saw the documents, that he was not in a warehouse cornered by Dante Bellevere. He was in a warehouse holding a shield she had handed him. The cold moved through her again. She put both hands in her lap and looked at the wall and did not let herself spiral. Spiraling was what happened when you let fear drive, and she had not survived 4 years by letting fear drive. She thought instead. She was a seamstress. She worked with old, damaged things, and she understood how they were made, at a level below the visible, and she understood how to work with that structure to produce something different from what you'd started with. You didn't destroy the old lace to fix it. You worked with what was there. What was there? Ledger pages that documented 20 years of very careful corruption, implicating people who had the power to make anything disappear, in the hands of a man who had just been given a clean exit from a situation that should have ended him tonight. What she needed. Something that made those pages more dangerous in Silas Crown's hands than in someone else's. Something that changed the calculus of who benefited from their existence. She looked at the ledger pages for a long time. Then she looked at the wedding veil in her mind, the repairs she'd made, the way the structure of old needle lace worked, the principle she'd explained to an apprentice once in a different life in Vienna. You couldn't copy lace of this age and quality convincingly enough to fool an expert, but you could work with the original structure to extend it, to add to it, to incorporate new elements so carefully that the join was invisible. The new work didn't erase the old. It used it. It made the old work do something it couldn't do alone. Mara sat at her work table at 4:15 in the morning and began very carefully to think about the Bellevere Gala. She had heard it mentioned twice. Once in Silas's threat, the gala, the wedding veil, the humiliation Silas had been planning for Dante in front of the city's most powerful families. She had registered it and moved past it, because there had been more immediate things to manage. Now she moved back to it. The gala, the veil, the ledger pages, the names she recognized. She picked up the repaired veil in her mind, the finished work, the invisible joins, the structural extension of something old into something that could bear new weight, and she began to understand what she was going to have to do. Not with her hands, not the way she'd been doing it, surviving, enduring, absorbing damage and continuing. What she was going to have to do was something she had never done before, something that was not in her nature and not in her training and not in the 4 years of careful, patient survival she'd built her life around. She was going to have to be the most dangerous person in the room. She gathered the documents, all of them, including the ledger pages. She put them back in the envelope. She sealed it again. She went to her bed and lay down on top of the covers in her clothes and closed her eyes. At 5:30, her phone buzzed. She was not asleep. She had not been asleep. Unknown number. She answered immediately. Silence. Then, Ms. Voss? Not Silas, one of his men, the one with the Brooklyn consonants from earlier. Mr. Crown wanted you to have something to think about before morning. A sound, then her own voice, tinny through a recording, unmistakable. I photographed everything before I put it in that envelope, including the pages that touched Dante's accounts. She had said it in the warehouse. She had said it clearly enough for a microphone to catch. Mr. Crown thinks, the voice said, that this recording, in the right hands, makes Ms. Voss a very interesting person to certain investigators who have been watching Mr. Bellavier's operation for some time. A pause. He also thinks that the right hands could be found very quickly if Miss Voss decided to become difficult. The line went dead. Mara lay on her bed in the 5:30 dark and looked at the ceiling and felt the walls of the last exit close. She had walked into the warehouse with evidence. She had walked out with the envelope, but not the advantage. And now Silas Crown had her own voice telling anyone who needed to hear it that she was knowingly connected to Dante Bellaviere's accounts. If she went to investigators, she became evidence herself. If she stayed silent, Silas held the recording. If she went to Dante, she brought him a problem she had created with her own overconfidence in a building of his, on a night when she'd already cost him more than she'd intended. She sat up. She reached for the envelope on her work table. She thought about the gala, which was, she knew because she'd heard it mentioned, in 9 days. 9 days was not very long. 9 days was also, if you were a woman who had learned to work in close detail with damaged things and understand their structure from the inside, enough time to do something that could not be undone. She was going to need the wedding veil. She was going to need access to the gala. And she was going to need to show Dante Bellavere what she'd found in the ledger pages before Silas Crown decided that the recording was more useful than the agreement they'd made in the warehouse. And she was at the garment house by 6:15. The building was still dark at that hour, the kind of dark that belonged to the structure itself rather than the absence of light. The accumulated dark of a building that had spent decades absorbing what happened inside it. Mara took the freight elevator with her shoulder against the gate and her bag in her hand and the envelope pressed flat against her ribs under her coat, held there by her own arm rather than any fastening, because she needed to feel it there. 3rd floor, the heavy door, the good locks. The veil was where she'd left it, on the shelf, in its tissue paper, inside the acid-free box she'd prepared. She took the box down and set it on the work table and opened it and looked at the veil for a moment in the early gray light. The repairs were invisible. She had done exactly what she'd said she would do, and the veil was exactly what it had been before the damage, which was beautiful, old and precise, and made by someone who had understood that the finest work was the kind that looked inevitable. She had 9 days. She had also, she discovered when she turned from the shelf, approximately 45 seconds before she was alone. Dante came through the back door at 6:17. He was wearing yesterday's clothes, or clothes exactly like them, and he had the specific look of a man who had not slept rather than a man who had slept badly. The difference was in the eyes, which in the former case went flat and very alert at the same time. He looked at her standing at the work table with the veil open in front of her, and he stopped walking. "You didn't wait," he said. "I don't wait well." She reached into her coat and took out the envelope and set it on the table between them. "Sit down. I need to show you something." He looked at the envelope, looked at her face. He pulled the chair from against the wall, the same chair he'd sat in uninvited the first evening, the chair that was usually occupied by her reference materials, and sat in it. No hesitation, no territorial display, just sat. She spread the documents. She walked him through it the way she'd walked herself through it at 4 a.m, moving from the outer edges inward, from the pieces she'd understood to the piece she hadn't. She did it systematically, pointing without touching, letting him read at his own pace at each stage. He was a fast reader and a quiet one. He didn't interrupt and he didn't react visibly, which she'd expected. He was a man who processed first and responded after, which was either a professional habit or a personality trait, and probably at this point was both indistinguishably. When she got to the ledger pages, she stopped talking and let him look. He looked for a long time. "You know these names?" she said. Not a question. "Some of them?" "The gala." She waited until he looked up. "Silas was planning to use the veil to humiliate you at the gala. You told me that, Or Caruso mentioned it. One of your people. 18 months. A high society event. The Wyndham Foundation dinner. December, 18 months ago. These transactions, she pointed at the lower right column. They're dated within 10 days of that event. Dante was quiet for a moment. She watched him make the connection, watched the moment it landed, the slight stilling of everything that happened when something registered at a level below thought. He was collecting at the gala, Dante said. Not collecting, recording, building. She traced the column without touching it. These aren't payments to him. These are payments he brokered, money moving between parties who needed an intermediary who would never talk. He was the room where things happened that couldn't happen anywhere else. She looked up. He's been doing it for 20 years. The operation, you know. The street level. The loan sharking. The territory disputes. That's the surface. This is what's underneath. He's a fixer, Dante said. He's a bank, Mara said, for secrets, and he has 20 years of deposits. The building settled around them. Outside, the city was beginning its morning version of itself. Truck engines, the distant percussion of a loading dock somewhere on the next block, the particular acoustic quality of early light hitting glass and brick. Dante leaned back in the chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was not something she'd seen him do before. The posture of a man letting something rise and fall in him before responding to it. The recording, he said. Not a question. She had told him about it on the phone at 6 a.m, the same call where she told him she was going to the garment house regardless. She had told him cleanly, with no softening, because she had made the mistake and it was her mistake, and she did not believe in managing other people's access to their own problems. He'll use it if we move on him directly, she said. If anything points at him openly, investigators, your people, anything that looks like pressure, he uses the recording to point at me, which points at you, which gives every name on those ledger pages a reason to make sure it all disappears, including us. So he's untouchable. He thinks he's untouchable. She put her finger, her left hand, glove off, the scarred one, on the ledger pages. But he's been building this for 20 years, and he's been so careful for so long that he's made one assumption that isn't correct. Dante looked at where her finger rested, then at her face. What assumption? That the only way to use what he has is to threaten to reveal it. She held his gaze. He's never considered what happens if it's already revealed. Specifically revealed. To the right people, in the right sequence, in the right context. She paused. The gala. The words sat between them. There's another Wyndham Foundation dinner, she said. 9 days. I looked it up this morning. The same people will be there. The foundation board. The donors. The city families who've been associated with it for decades. She watched his face. Some of those names are on these pages. You want to take this to the gala. Not the way Silas planned, not as a trophy, as a detonator. She straightened. But I need access, and I need the veil, and I need you to trust me on the execution because the execution has to be mine. Dante was quiet for a long time, long enough that Mara counted the seconds. Not consciously, just the way her mind ran counts when it was managing uncertainty. She got to 41 before he spoke. What happens to the people on those pages, he said, saying the names. Some of them aren't. He stopped. Not everyone on there chose to be on there. She hadn't expected that. She looked at him. Some of the transactions, he said. Some of them are people paying to keep something quiet that Crown was already holding over them. Not people who came to him. People he found. His jaw moved. I know 2 of those names personally. I know what he has on them. They're not clean. Nobody on that list is clean. But there's a difference between someone who built something dirty and someone Crown built a cage around. Mara looked at the ledger pages. She looked at them with this new reading and found, when she applied it, that he was right. The shape of some of the transactions was different from others. Some were exchanges, the voluntary architecture of corruption. Others were the different shape of a toll booth. You pass through because not passing through costs more. I can see the difference, she said slowly. In the structure of the payments, I can see which ones are. Can you work with that? She looked at him. What do you mean? Can you use this? He gestured at the documents. In a way that hits who it needs to hit without burning everyone on the page. She thought about needle lace. She thought about working at the level below the visible, about the principle of selective repair. You identified the damaged junctions. You worked on exactly those. You left the intact sections alone. Yes, she said, but I need more time with the documents, and I need help understanding which names fall in which category. I can do that. Today. Today, he said. They worked for 4 hours. Side by side at the work table, her documents spread between them, his voice moving through the names and the figures with a precision that told her he'd been carrying the map of his city's architecture in his head for a long time. He didn't editorialize. He didn't explain more than she asked for. He treated it like a technical exercise, which was the same way she treated restoration. And the parallel was so close that she noted it and filed it in the place where she was storing things about him that she didn't have time to examine yet. By 10:30, she had what she needed. By 11, she had a plan that was not yet complete, but had the shape of something that could become complete if the next 9 days went the way she needed them to go. By noon, she had the veil back on the work table, unrolled, and she was looking at it. "What are you thinking?" Dante said. "I'm thinking about what you can hide in lace," she said, "if you're small enough about it." He looked at the veil, then at her. "Silas is going to present it at the gala," she said. That was his plan from the beginning. Take your mother's veil, take it to the event where the city's most powerful people will be in one room, and present it as a trophy. A statement. You had this, and now he has it. She touched the edge of the veil gently with one scarred finger. He has the original, or he thinks he does. Dante went very still. "The repairs I made," she said. "The junction points, the extended border sections, they're invisible. I told you. You can't find them if you don't know exactly where to look." She paused. The lace structure, the specific pattern of Venetian needle lace at this age, and construction. If you know the pattern, if you've spent as much time as I have in the last 24 hours knowing the pattern, you can work things into it that aren't visible until you know what you're looking for. You want to put evidence into the veil. Specific evidence, selected, the way we just selected it. The names and figures that are voluntary participants, not coerced ones, encoded into the lace structure itself, in a way that requires the right person with the right knowledge to extract it. She looked at him. When Silas presents the veil at the gala, he thinks he's humiliating you. Instead, the veil is already in the hands of someone who can read it. Who reads it? I need a name. Someone at the Wyndham Gala. Someone who isn't on those pages. Someone who has reason to want what's on those pages, and someone who will know what to do with it when I explain what they're looking at. She paused. Someone you trust. Dante was quiet. Camille Okafor, he said finally. She's on the foundation board. Former federal prosecutor. She left the office 3 years ago, and she's had her reasons to want Crown in a room she controls. He stopped. She lost a case 4 years ago. Crown's man, not Crown himself. But she knows the shape of it. Can you get me to her before the gala? Yes. Without Crown knowing. Yes. Mara looked at the veil for another long moment, then she rolled it carefully back onto its acid-free tube. I need 6 days with this. Minimum. Possibly 7. She looked at her hands, both of them, the scarring, the still tender split along the left ring finger. It's the most precise thing I've ever attempted. I can't tell you it will work. I can tell you I'll make it work, or I'll know by day 4 that it won't, and we find a different approach. And if Crown moves before the gala, then we use the documents directly and I deal with the recording separately. She picked up the veil in its tube and held it. But he won't. He walked out of that warehouse last night with everything he needed to feel safe. He'll sit on it. He'll let us feel the pressure build. She met Dante's eyes. He likes the slow version. I've been watching him for 4 years. Dante held her gaze. 7 days, he said. 6, she said. I want a day left over. Something moved in his face that wasn't quite a smile but occupied some of the same territory. He stood, picked up his coat from the cutting table. At the door he paused. The regular door, the employee door, the one with the broken buzzer, and looked back. "The third floor," he said. "As long as you need it." He left. Mara set the veil back down and went to her kit and opened it and began to take out what she would need. The finest needles, the lightest thread, gossamer weight, the weight you used when the thing you were working with was old enough and precise enough that anything heavier would show. The magnifying glass. The pattern notes she'd made during the original repair, because you needed the map before you could work in the dark. She had 6 days. She had a plan that was also, if she was honest with herself, a prayer she wasn't allowed to say. She had her mother's scissors with the worn wooden handles in her ruined, capable, surviving hands. She put her gloves on, took the left one back off, left it off. She worked without it. The 6 days were the longest and shortest of her life, which she understood was a contradiction and meant it anyway. She worked 12-hour days at the table near the north window, the gray, merciless, flaw-finding light. She worked at a scale that was below the comfortable range of her vision, even with the magnifying glass, which meant headaches by early afternoon that she addressed with aspirin and ignored beyond that. The left hand split twice more along the ring finger scar. She dealt with it and continued. What she was doing did not have a technical name because it had never been done before, or at least not done like this. The principle was simple, which was different from the execution being simple. Venetian needle lace at this age worked on a structural pattern, a mathematical repetition with local variations, the way a fingerprint repeated with individual specificity. If you knew the base pattern and you knew the variations, you could encode information into the variations without disturbing the visible pattern. A trained eye would see lace. A trained eye who knew exactly what to look for, who had been told in advance what the encoding key was, would see something else. She spent day 1 mapping the existing variation pattern. She spent day 2 developing the encoding key, working out how to translate figures and initial sequences into lace variations that were both subtle enough to be invisible and distinct enough to be unambiguous when you knew how to read them. She spent days 3, 4, and 5 executing. This was the part that required the most from her hands, which gave her the most difficulty and which she pushed through with the particular bloody-mindedness that had gotten her through 4 years of much larger difficulties. Her left hand cooperated imperfectly. She adapted. Adaptation was the other name for survival. On the afternoon of day 5, Dante came to the 3rd floor with a woman he introduced as Camille Okafor. She was 50 or thereabouts, with the kind of face that had been formed by decisions rather than softened by the avoidance of them. Precise, observant, carrying something behind her eyes that Mara recognized as old anger that had been refined into something more useful than anger. They sat at the work table, the 3 of them, and Mara explained. She explained everything: the documents, the ledger pages, the encoding, the veil. She spread the documents between them and walked Camille through the selection, the voluntary participants, the toll booth names excluded. She explained the encoding key. She showed Camille the veil under the magnifying glass and indicated where to look and watched Camille's face as she looked and saw it. Camille Okafor was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "How did you know I could read this?" "I didn't," Mara said. "Dante said you were the right person. I built the key to be explainable in 20 minutes to anyone with the right background. You're the right background." Camille looked at the veil, looked at the documents, looked at Mara's hands, the scarring, the ring finger that was newly dressed this morning, and then, with the quality of a person who has trained themselves not to let reaction lead, looked at Mara's face. "You've been in his orbit for 4 years," she said. "Crowns. My brother's debt, yes. And you built this?" She gestured at the documents. "While paying that debt. I built it because I needed something. I didn't know what I needed it for yet." Camille nodded slowly. "The gala is in 3 days. I'm on the board. I'll be there when Crown presents it." She looked at the veil. "Will he let me examine it?" "He'll try to control the moment. The presentation will be designed for maximum theater." Mara paused. "But there will be a moment. There always is with him, where he invites examination, where he wants witnesses to confirm he has what he says he has. He'll want an expert. And you'll be there to provide the key." "I'll be there," Mara said. Dante, who had been quiet through most of this, looked at her. "You're going to be at the gala?" "Yes. Crown will see you." "I know." "Mara, He'll see me walk in and he'll know something is wrong and he'll spend the next 40 minutes trying to work out what it is. She met Dante's eyes. That's the 40 minutes Camille needs. Camille looked between them with the expression of a woman reading a room she'd been reading for 30 seconds and had already largely understood. She folded her hands on the table. I'll need the encoding key in writing. I'll need 2 days with it before the gala. I'll have it to you tomorrow, Mara said. Camille stood. She looked at the veil one more time. The repaired lace, the invisible work, the thing that held more than it appeared to hold. Miss Voss, she said, the people on those pages, the voluntary ones, the ones you've selected, they have resources. When this comes out, they will look for where it came from. They will look for who built this. I know, Mara said. Are you prepared for that? I've been prepared for something like that for 4 years. She said it without bravado. Just the fact of it, plain. Camille nodded once. She picked up her coat and she left, and Mara and Dante were alone again in the third-floor room with the veil between them. You should have told me you were going, Dante said. His voice had the quiet, controlled quality of something that was working to stay quiet and controlled. That you planned to be there. Would you have agreed? No. Then I'm telling you now, she said, instead of after, which is an improvement. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his face. The thing she'd been watching surface and submerge for 9 days now. The thing she didn't have a clean name for. He moved it back under before she could read it completely. I'll be there, he said. I know. My people will be. I know. She turned back to the veil. Day 6 tomorrow. I have 3 sections left. He stayed for another minute, which she was aware of without turning around. Then he left, and she picked up her needle, and she worked. Day 6 was the section she'd saved because they were hardest. The border junctions where the pattern complexity was highest, and the encoding had to be the most precise to remain readable. Her hands ached from the inside out by noon. She took aspirin. She drank 2 cups of bad coffee from the break room, which she'd never done before, and it made her hands shake slightly, which was the opposite of useful, so she stopped. By evening, the veil was done. She put the magnifying glass down and sat back and looked at it. Finished, whole, repaired, and then extended, and then encoded, and through all of it, still the thing it had always been. Beautiful, old, made by someone who understood that the finest work looked inevitable. She sat with it for a long time in the evening light. Then she packaged it. She packaged it the way she packaged everything she cared about. The acid-free tissue, the proper tube, the outer box. She wrote nothing on the outside. She put it on the shelf. She went home. She slept for 8 hours, which was more than she'd slept in any single stretch for the past week. And she woke at 4 in the morning, not from a dream, but from the clean, sudden consciousness of someone whose body has decided that preparation is over. The gala was tonight. She bathed. She dressed with care, not in the way of a woman dressing for an event, but in the way of a person who understands that what you wear is part of what you communicate. And she needed to communicate something specific tonight. She owned one dress that was right for the Wyndham Foundation dinner. Dark blue, high-necked, bought 3 years ago for a museum event she'd attended in her other life, her Vienna life, and worn twice since then to things that hadn't required it. She put it on. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. She put both gloves on. Then she took them off. She put on the right glove, left the left bare. The scarring on her left hand was visible and thorough, and she looked at it in the mirror, and then she stopped looking and picked up her bag. She had one more thing to do before the gala. She went to the garment house, 3rd floor. She took the box down from the shelf and opened it and looked at the veil one last time under the north window light. She looked at the section she'd worked on, invisible to the untrained eye, visible with the key, unambiguous if you knew what you were reading. She looked at the repairs she'd made 9 days ago, which felt like a different season of her life. She closed the box. She was still standing there when she heard the door, not the back door, not the employee door, the freight elevator. She heard the mechanism, the familiar groan of it rising, and she turned with the box in her hands, and the elevator arrived and the gate opened, and it was not Dante. It was one of Crown's men, the one with the Brooklyn consonants. He was not alone. He looked at the box in her hands. He looked at her face. He had a particular expression, professionally neutral, the expression of a man executing a task that doesn't require his feelings about it. "Mr. Crown's compliments," he said. "He thought you might be coming here this morning. He'd like the veil." Mara held the box. She held it with both hands, the scarred one and the gloved one. And she thought about 9 days of work and 6-hour nights, and aspirin and bad coffee, and her hands splitting and continuing to work. She thought about what was inside the box and what that meant to anyone who didn't have the key. "Tell Mr. Crown," she said, "that he's welcome to it." The man with the Brooklyn consonants looked at her for a moment, checked her face for a trick, which was the correct instinct and, in this case, insufficient. He stepped forward and took the box. She let him take it. They left. The elevator descended. The building went quiet. Mara stood alone in the third-floor room and felt the day arrange itself around her with a clarity that was almost physical, like stepping out of a building into cold air and feeling your lungs open. Crown had the veil. He had had it, in fact, for most of the last 9 days, the one he'd taken from her in the warehouse, the original, unrepaired version she'd handed him as supposed leverage. He had that veil. He intended to bring it to the Wyndham Foundation Gala tonight and present it in front of the city's most powerful families as a statement about Dante Bellivere's reach and its limits. What he did not know, what he could not know, because to know it, he would have needed to understand the level at which she worked, the level below the visible, was that the veil she'd just handed his man was not the same veil she'd repaired 9 days ago. She had made 2. The second one she'd started on day 3, working in the hours between midnight and 2 when the rest of her had been sleeping and her hands had been the only part of her still running. It was not a perfect copy. She didn't have enough time for perfection, but it was close enough that the difference was not visible to anyone who was not both looking for it and had the trained eye to find it. The lace was the same age. She had sourced 3 small panels of period-correct Venetian needle lace from her own collection, pieces she'd acquired in Vienna and brought with her across the ocean in a flat box she kept under her bed. The structure was the same. The apparent damage pattern was the same, because she had studied the original's damage before repairing it, and she had a very good memory for structure. The second veil had no encoding in it. It was lace and nothing else. The first veil, the repaired original, the one with 6 days of her finest and most precise work embedded in its junctions, was still in the garment house, on the shelf, in a different box, under a roll of muslin she'd had since Vienna and no longer used for anything. She went to the shelf. She took down the box. She opened it and looked at the veil, the real one, the finished one, and she picked it up gently with both hands and held it for a moment in the north window light. Then she put it in her bag, against her body, and she went downstairs to find a cab to take her to the Wyndham Foundation dinner. In the elevator, descending, she counted the floors the way she always counted them. 4, 3, 2, 1. The gate opened. The lobby was gray and ordinary in the morning light. Her phone buzzed. Dante. "Crown's man was at the building," she said before he could speak. "I know. A pause. The quality of his voice was wrong. Too controlled, which was what his voice did when something underneath it was not controlled at all. "What did they take?" "The second veil," she said. Silence. Then, "You made 2. "I made 2. Another silence. Longer. "Where are you?" he said. "Lobby. I'm coming to you." She pushed through the front door onto Carmine Street, the October air sharp and clean after 6 days of recycled third-floor air. "Dante, whatever you've been planning to do tonight, your version of it, I need you to hold it. Don't move on Crown before Camille has the veil in her hands. And if something goes wrong, then we discuss that when something goes wrong." She raised her hand for a cab. "Nothing is going to go wrong. You can't know." "I know Silas Crown," she said. "I know exactly how he'll run tonight. I know where he'll stand and when he'll present it and what he needs the moment to look like." A cab pulled over. She got in. "I've been watching him for 4 years and I've been building toward this for 9 days. I know every stitch of what's in that room." She heard him breathe, once, twice. "The car will be outside the Wyndham in an hour," he said. "I'll be there before that. she said. She gave the driver the address, and the cab moved into traffic, and the city opened up around her. The ordinary, enormous, indifferent city, doing what it always did, which was continue regardless of what any particular person inside it had at stake. She sat in the back with her bag in her lap, and the veil inside it pressed against her leg, and she watched the streets go by, and she did not let herself think about what she was about to do. She thought instead about her mother, young in a photograph, laughing at something outside the frame, hands mid-gesture, telling a story. She thought about the principle her mother had taught her before any technical thing, before the needles and the thread and the particular motion of the wrist that made a French knot lie flat. The principle was this: you look at the thing in front of you until you understand exactly how it's made. Then you work with what's there. You don't fight the material, you work with it. The thing in front of her tonight was a man who had spent 20 years building a structure of fear and silence and leverage. She had spent 9 days understanding exactly how it was made. Now she was going to work with it. The cab stopped at a light. Outside the window, a woman in a gray coat was waiting for the walk signal with a child beside her, the child's hand in hers, the child looking up at her and saying something that made the woman smile. The smile arriving a half-second later, the way smiles do when the thing that causes them is a small, unguarded moment. Mara watched them and thought about her mother's hands, mid-gesture. The light changed. The cab moved. The Wyndham Foundation dinner was 40 blocks north, and Silas Crown was already there. She would have bet her mother's scissors on it, because he always arrived early to places he controlled. And the second veil was in his hands, and he did not yet know what he was holding. Mara put her gloved right hand over her bare left hand in her lap, felt the scarring under her palm, held it there. She was 28 years old, and she had survived 4 years of a man's patience turned into a weapon. And she had rebuilt her hands around that survival. And tonight she was going to walk into a room full of the most powerful people in New York City, and she was going to make 4 years of paying attention count for something that could not be undone. The cab pulled up outside the Wyndham's address, a limestone building on the Upper East Side that wore its importance the way old money always wore it, quietly, with the confidence of something that had never needed to announce itself. Light in the tall windows, a line of cars at the curb, men with the particular posture of security personnel stationed at the entrance with the professional subtlety of security personnel who'd been told to look unsubtly subtle. She paid the driver. She got out. She looked up at the building for exactly 3 seconds. Then she straightened her coat, settled the bag on her shoulder, and walked toward the entrance with her bare left hand visible and her chin level and the finished veil warm against her side. Behind her, from the east, she heard a car she recognized. The engine sound of the dark sedan, the one that had taken her to Lenox Hill and waited outside Hubert Street and sat at the curb on Delancey at 5:30 in the morning while she had stood on a wet sidewalk understanding the shape of her mistake. She didn't look back. She went in. The Wyndham Foundation dinner was 300 people in a ballroom that had been designed in a century when ballrooms were built to make you feel the weight of occasion. Chandeliers that were more practical statement than decorative. Heavy, old, the kind of light fitting that communicated permanence. Round tables with the specific flower arrangements of events managed by people who understood that flowers at this level were also a communication. A stage at the far end with a podium, and to its left, a display area that had been set up recently. The table covering too crisp, the lighting directed with the specific intentionality of something prepared for presentation. Mara saw it the moment she entered. She also saw, at the table nearest the stage, Camille Okafor in a dark green dress, talking to a man on her left with the surfaces of someone whose attention was entirely elsewhere. Camille's eyes moved across the room when Mara entered. They met Mara's for exactly 1 second, and then moved away. Good. Mara found her table. She was here as a guest of the Bellevere family, which was a social fiction that Dante had arranged, and that she had not examined too closely, because some fictions needed to go unexamined to function. She sat. She ordered water from the passing server. She looked at the room with the thorough, unhurried attention she'd learned in Vienna and refined over 4 years of watching for the specific signals of threat. She found Silas Crown at 11 o'clock from her position. He was at the bar with 2 men she didn't know, and one she did, a city councilman whose name had appeared in 2 of the ledger page transactions. He was wearing his pleasantness like his best suit, which it was, and he was holding a glass of something amber and doing the specific social performance of a man absolutely at ease in a room he controlled. He hadn't seen her yet. She watched him for a moment, thought about 4 years, thought about a parking structure on West 14th, and 3 men and a fourth who explained things patiently. She looked at her bare left hand in her lap. Then Silas turned and he saw her. She watched it happen, the way his body registered her presence before his face caught up. The slight reorganization of his posture that was not visible from across the room unless you were looking for it, and she was always looking for it. His pleasantness stayed in place. It was a good mask. She'd given him credit for that consistently. But underneath the pleasantness, he was calculating. She could see the calculation the way she could see damage in old lace, not the surface, the structure underneath. He excused himself from the bar. He walked toward her. Mara sat at her table with her water in her bare left hand, and she watched him come, and she let her heartbeat be exactly what it was, fast, not panicked. And she thought about the veil in her bag, and the veil in his possession, and the 9 days between those two things. He stopped at her table with his pleasant face and his amber glass, and he said quietly, so only she could hear, "This is a mistake." "Sit down," she said. He looked at the empty chair across from her. "I don't think—" "Sit down," she said again, "because I'm going to tell you what's in that veil, and you need to be sitting." His pleasant face did something she had been waiting 4 years to see it do. It broke. Just for a second, just enough. He sat down. And across the room, Mara saw Dante Bellevere walk through the main entrance of the Wyndham Foundation dinner with Caruso behind him, and 3 other men she recognized from the warehouse. And she saw him scan the room with the thoroughness she'd come to know. And she saw the moment he found her, still at her table, unharmed, sitting across from Silas Crown. And she saw something in his face that she stored in the place where she was keeping things she didn't have time for yet. She turned back to Silas. "The veil your man picked up this morning," she said, "is a copy. The original, the one with everything in it, is in my bag." She held his eyes. "And Camille Okafor has had the encoding key for 2 days." Silas Crown set his glass down on the table with a precise, controlled movement that was the only controlled thing about him in that moment. "You're bluffing," he said. Mara reached into her bag. She put her bare left hand, scarred, marked, surviving, flat on the tablecloth between them, and with her right hand she set the veil's box beside it. "Open it," she said. The chandeliers burned overhead. 300 people moved and talked and performed their occasion around them. Somewhere across the room, Camille Okafor was turning in her chair toward the display table by the stage. Silas Crown looked at the box. He looked at Mara's hand. He looked at her face, and what he found there was not the woman who had stood in a parking structure 4 years ago and learned to make herself small. What he found there was something that had been made by 4 years of exactly that. Something that had come out the other side of it into a shape that was not small at all. He reached for the box. Silas Crown opened the box. He did it the way a man opens something he's afraid of, carefully, with the specific deliberateness of someone who needs to control the pace of what he's about to find out. His fingers on the tissue paper were steady. She gave him that. 20 years of building something like what he'd built required a certain baseline steadiness, the kind that didn't abandon you even when everything else started coming apart. He lifted the veil from its tissue. He held it in the chandelier light, and he looked at it the way she'd looked at it 9 days ago, with the attention of someone trying to read structure at a level below the visible. He turned it slowly. His eyes moved across the lace with the precision of a man who had already, in the hours since his man had brought him the copy, begun to understand that he might be holding the wrong thing. He was quiet for a very long time. Around them, the dinner continued its occasion. Glasses lifted, voices at the particular pitch of expensive rooms, the distant sound of a string quartet running something familiar in the background of everything. 300 people conducting the social performance of their position, and here at this table, in the middle of all of it, a man who had spent 20 years making other people afraid discovering what it felt like to read the ground and find it was not where he'd thought. "Where?" he said. One word, flat. "In the junctions," Mara said. "The border repairs." You'd need the encoding key and a trained eye and about 2 hours of uninterrupted time with the magnifying glass. She looked at the veil in his hands. Or you could take my word for it. He lowered the veil. He looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on him. Not the performed pleasantness, not the patience as violence. Something older than both of those things. Something that had been living underneath the performance for a long time and was now, in the specific pressure of this moment, coming to the surface whether he wanted it to or not. How much is in there, he said. Enough. She kept her voice level, even. The voice of a woman who has done the work and knows what it amounts to. The voluntary transactions, the facilitated payments, the brokered arrangements, the names of people who came to you because you built something they needed, not the people you coerced. She watched his face. I made a distinction. You should know that. Something moved in his expression at that. She couldn't have said what it was. Not gratitude, nothing as clean as gratitude. Something more complicated. The look of a man being shown that the person across from him has been paying more attention than he accounted for. Why? He said. Because some of those people were also afraid of you, she said. And I know what it costs to be afraid of you for a long time. I wasn't going to use that against them. She paused. Only against you. Silas looked at the veil in his hands for another moment. Then he looked across the room. She followed his gaze. He was looking at Camille Okafor, who was now turned toward the display table near the stage with the focused expression of a woman who had already, in the last 20 minutes, confirmed what Mara had spent 6 days putting into the lace. She has the key, he said. She's had it for 2 days. And she's a former federal prosecutor with a reason and a reading knowledge of what she's looking at in 2 days of preparation. Mara looked at him. Yes, she's already. Silas set the veil on the table between them. He set it down gently, which she noted. Even now, even in this moment, he set it down gently because he had been in rooms with fine things long enough to know how to handle them. That told her something she filed without knowing exactly where yet. He picked up his glass, drank from it, set it back with the same precise control. The recording, he said. Camille knows about the recording. She knows what I said and how it was obtained and what it means contextually. Mara held his eyes. In the context of everything else she's holding tonight, what it means is very little. You can't know that. I know she spent 3 years building a case that fell apart because your man had better lawyers and a friendlier jury. I know she left the prosecutor's office because of it. She paused. I know she has been, in the 3 years since, building something on her own, something she couldn't use the official machinery for. She watched his face carefully. I think you know that too. I think that's why she was on your list of people to manage. I think she's been on that list for a while. Silas was very still. She's not manageable tonight, Mara said quietly. He looked at the veil. He looked at Camille. He looked at Mara's bare left hand still flat on the tablecloth. The scarring, the ring finger, the evidence written into her skin. Then Silas Crown did something she had not prepared for. Not in 9 days of planning. Not in 4 years of watching him. He laughed. It was not the performance laugh she'd heard him use in meetings. The warm signals that your harmless laugh of a man who understood laughter as a social tool. This was something else. Short, real. The sound of a man recognizing something in his own situation that was, when you stripped it down to its structure, genuinely and darkly funny. A seamstress, he said. Yes. I put my hands on a seamstress's hands, he said, and the laugh went out of his face and left something flat and tired behind it. And you spent 4 years turning it into this. You spent 4 years giving me time, she said. I used it. He looked at her for a long moment. The real look, not the managed look, not the pleasant look. The look that had been under everything the whole time. What do you want? He said. Specifically, tonight. What is the outcome you're here for? I want you to stand up from this table, she said. I want you to go to that display table by the stage. I want you to present your trophy. My way. She reached across and picked up the veil from where he'd set it, and she put it back in its box, and she closed the box. And then I want you to remember, every day for however long you keep operating, that there's a woman who has the original and the key and the relationship with Camille Okafor, and that none of that goes away. He looked at the closed box. You're not going to use it, he said. Destroy me entirely. You could. With what you have and what Okafor has, you could. He was working it out in real time. She could see the calculation. But you're not going to. Not unless you give me a reason to. Why? She picked up the box and put it in her bag. She looked at him. Because destroying you entirely requires things I'm not willing to be responsible for yet. The coerced names on those pages, the toll booth people, some of what they're keeping quiet is ugly, but some of it is just human and private and doesn't belong to anyone else. She settled the bag on her shoulder. And because if I use everything, the only thing standing at the end of it is me, and I have other plans for what comes next. Silas studied her with the expression of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew about a particular variable. This is a cage, he said, what you've built. It's an arrangement, she said, the same kind of arrangement you've been making for 20 years. The difference is, who holds the terms? She watched that land. She watched him sit with it, the man who had built 20 years of leverage, meeting the specific experience of having leverage built on him in return, and finding that the architecture was one he recognized from the inside. The debt, she said. My brother's. Confirmed gone. Tonight. Confirmed, he said, flat, irrefutable. And your man with the Brooklyn accent doesn't come near my building or my brother or me again. Agreed. Your word. His mouth moved, something that might have been the vestige of the pleasantness, not warm, not performed, just the ghost of a habit. You want my word, he said. I want to be able to look at your face when you give it, she said, so I can remember what it looks like. He looked at her. He gave her 4 full seconds of his real face. No management, no theater, just the face of Silas Crown, 50-something, who had built something that was finally going to hold him accountable for having built it. You have my word, he said. She stood up. Across the room she saw Dante. He was standing near the east wall with Caruso, and he had been watching this table for the last 10 minutes with the quality of attention that was also a form of restraint, the specific restraint of a man who had made a promise about not moving until she was clear and was keeping it by an act of will that was visible in the set of his shoulders from 40 feet away. She looked at him. He looked at her. She gave him the smallest of nods. Not a signal, just an acknowledgement. Just, I'm here, I'm whole, it's done. Some of the tension went out of his shoulders. Not all of it. Some. Silas stood. He smoothed his jacket. He picked up his glass and set it back down and left it there. And he walked toward the display table by the stage with the particular walk of a man who has decided that the only available form of dignity is to choose his direction rather than be pushed. Mara watched him go. Then she walked toward Camille Okafor. Camille was at the display table when Mara reached her. She had the copy veil, the one Silas's man had taken from the garment house that morning, spread carefully before her, and she was examining it with a magnifying glass she'd produced from somewhere, and her face had the expression of a woman who has found what she came to find and is now in the process of understanding its full dimensions. She looked up when Mara stopped beside her. He's coming, Mara said quietly, nodding toward Silas. I see him. Camille looked back at the veil. This is the copy. Yes, the original is in my bag. You don't need the original for tonight. Everything you've been looking at in the encoding key is sufficient, and I can provide the original to any proceeding that needs it. She paused, along with my testimony about how it was made and what it documents. Camille looked at her then, a direct, full look that assessed without performing assessment. That will require you to be available. Visible. Your name attached to this. I know. It puts you in a specific position. I've been in specific positions before, Mara said. I've gotten good at them. Camille was quiet for a moment, then, the people on those pages, the ones you excluded, the coerced ones. She held Mara's eyes. You made that distinction intentionally. Yes. Without being asked. Yes. Camille held her gaze for another moment, then she looked back at the veil. I've been working toward Crown for 3 years, she said, with a fraction of what you put together in 14 months. She shook her head slightly. Not in disbelief, but in recognition. He underestimated you profoundly. Most people do, Mara said. I've learned to find it useful. Silas reached the display table. He set the box down. The copy veil, packaged as she'd packaged it. And he looked at Camille, and he looked at the veil she'd been examining, and he looked at Mara, and then he straightened and performed the last social act of the evening, which was the act of a man presenting something to a room without letting the room see that the thing was no longer a weapon in his hands. He was good at it. She had to give him that. The pleasantness came back like a coat you put on in cold weather, automatic and covering. He addressed the nearest cluster of guests with the smooth ease of long practice, and the cluster turned toward the display table with the well-conditioned attention of people at events like this who understand that presentations are a form of attendance they owe, and the evening proceeded. It was Camille who stepped forward when Silas finished, who asked the questions, smooth, precise, the questions of a former prosecutor who knows exactly which thread to pull and in what order, and who received Silas Crown's answers with the expression of a woman filing each one in a structure that would survive the night. Mara stood to the side. She watched. She watched Silas's face during Camille's questions. She watched the specific moment he understood that the exchange he was in was not the one he'd designed, that this was not theater for the room, but procedure for something that would outlast the evening. She watched him adapt. He was good at adapting. He had built 20 years of leverage on exactly that quality, but he was adapting inside a room where the walls had moved, and he didn't know yet where all of them had ended up. Afterward, in the slow dissolution of the formal dinner into its later, more fluid stage, Mara found a chair near the windows and sat in it. Her bag was on her lap. The veil was in the bag. Her left hand was bare and her right hand was gloved, and she realized with some surprise, deeply and thoroughly tired in a way that was completely different from the sustained adrenaline exhaustion of the last 9 days. This was the tiredness on the other side of something. The tiredness of a tension that had been held for a long time finally releasing. She sat with it. Let it be what it was. You need to eat something. She looked up. Dante. He had a plate. A real one, not a cocktail plate. A dinner plate with actual food on it acquired from somewhere. And he put it on the small table beside her chair, and then sat in the chair next to her without asking, which was, she thought, simply what he did. She looked at the plate, looked at him. Thank you, she said. It came out smaller than she intended. Camille called me 20 minutes ago, he said. From across the room, which is... She doesn't do that. Call from across the room. He looked at the plate rather than at her, which gave her the specific privacy of not being watched while he said the next thing. She said, and I'm giving you this verbatim, your seamstress just handed me 20 years of Silas Crown on a piece of Venetian lace. I want her name on the preliminary filing by Monday. Mara looked at the windows. Outside, the city was doing its night version. Lit up, restless, entirely itself. That's my name on a legal proceeding, she said. Yes. That's a specific kind of visible. Yes. She thought about it. She had thought about it, obliquely, in the 9 days of working. Had known it was coming, had chosen it every morning when she picked up her needle and kept working. But thinking about a thing and hearing it stated plainly were different experiences, and she let herself feel the difference. Okay, she said. Dante looked at her then. Okay. I said I wanted other plans for what came next, she said. This is part of them. She picked up the fork from the plate. I'm going to eat this, and then I'm going to go home, and I'm going to sleep for approximately 11 hours, and then I'm going to deal with what Monday looks like. I'll have a car. I'll take a cab, she said. Not unkindly, just the fact of what she needed tonight, which was the ordinary anonymous transit of a person moving through her own city under her own direction. Thank you for the plate. He was quiet for a moment. The garment house, he said. The accounts. What I told you. I know. You said it was clean. I need you to know it's not a mitigation. He said it without looking for her to let him off the hook. Flat and accurate. You worked in my building for 11 months, and I knew it wasn't a simple garment house, and I didn't tell you. The fact that I was already cleaning it up doesn't change what it was while you were in it. Mara ate a bite of whatever was on the plate. It was something with mushrooms, well made, the kind of food that required a kitchen taking itself seriously. She chewed. She thought. No, she said. It doesn't change it. He nodded. Once. The nod of a man who has said the thing that needed saying and is not going to offer follow-up arguments. She looked at him sideways. The commission, she said. Your mother's veil. Was that? She paused, working out how to ask it. Was that because of what my work was? Or was it because you needed a skilled person in the building who would keep their mouth shut? It was the question she'd been not asking for 10 days. She had assembled it in the parking structure on West 14th and carried it up through 4 years and 9 days of working with her hands and 1 long evening in a warehouse and 6 days of the finest needlework of her life. And she was asking it now, in a chair by the window at the Wyndham Foundation dinner with a plate of mushrooms something on the table beside her, because she was too tired to carry it any further. Dante looked at her. He took his time with it. The same unhurried quality he brought to everything. The quality of a man who had decided long ago that answers that weren't accurate weren't useful, and was willing to take the time required to be accurate. Both, he said, at the beginning. She felt that land. Let it. And then, he said, and stopped. She waited. My mother's veil was damaged for 6 years, he said. I knew it needed repair. I kept not... There was no urgency to it. It was a thing I was going to do eventually. He looked at his hands for a moment, which was the first time she'd seen him look at his own hands. I saw your work. The pieces in Kowalski's office. She keeps samples from anyone new she hires who's above a certain level. You had 4 pieces in there. I looked at them for a long time. He paused. Then I thought about the veil. Mara was quiet. The commission was the veil, he said. The other thing was already in motion. They happened to be simultaneous. He looked at her. I am not going to tell you one was the reason for the other. They were separate and they were simultaneous, and I understand how that looks from your position, and I don't have a clean version of it to offer you. She thought about this. She thought about the veil, which had been in her hands for the last 10 days in one form or another, and which had started as the most difficult restoration she'd done in years, and had become something she couldn't have described in technical terms, because what it had become didn't have a technical name. My mother would have liked you, she said quietly. Not to him. To herself, almost. Repeating the words he'd said to her the first evening, examining them in this new light. He heard her. He didn't respond to it directly, which was the right instinct. The 3rd floor, he said after a moment. What you told me. That you'd come back for your work, but every door needed to be what it appeared to be. I remember. The building is clean. Has been for 11 months. That's not going to change. He held her eyes. And you have more work waiting. Kowalski has been managing the commission queue for the last 9 days without telling anyone why, because she didn't want to explain why her best restorer was occupied, and she has 3 pieces that are going to require someone she trusts. He paused. She told me to tell you she's not sorry for waiting, but she'd appreciate hearing from you. Mara felt something that might have been a laugh, working its way up from somewhere below her diaphragm. It didn't quite make it out, but she felt it. Mrs. Kowalski waits for no one, she said. Apparently she waited for you? She finished what was on the plate. She sat back. Outside, the city was still there, still itself, still going. She watched it for a moment through the Wyndham's tall windows. I need to go home, she said. I know. She picked up her bag. She stood. He stood when she did, which she hadn't expected and didn't comment on. She looked at him in the chandelier light. The man who had come in through her back door twice and sat in her reference chair uninvited and given her his word 3 times and kept it twice and was in the process of whether he would keep it the 3rd time, which was the one that went on indefinitely. Monday, she said. I'll make sure Camille has everything she needs from my side. And Crown. Crown knows where he stands. His voice was even. He'll be careful for a long time. And when careful becomes inconvenient. Dante met her eyes. Then it's handled. She had pushed on that phrase once before, in a different conversation, in his Tribeca apartment. She had pushed on it and gotten the same answer, and she had decided then that pushing further was not going to produce a different kind of answer because the answer was not withholding information from her. It was the complete answer, which was, there are things I know how to do, and you don't need to know exactly how I do them. She had decided then that she could live with that. She had not changed her mind. She was a woman who worked with damaged things and understood that completeness was not the same as perfection, and that what you were working with was always more complicated than the version of it you'd started with. And you found a way to work with that, or you didn't work at all. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said. She left. The cab home was quiet in the way late-night city cabs were quiet. The driver's radio on low, a station playing something old and instrumental, the streets going past in their orange-lit stream. She sat in the back with her bag in her lap and her bare left hand resting on it, and she didn't think about anything in particular. She let the city go past, and she breathed, and she realized with some surprise, not afraid. Not the absence of fear the way numbness was the absence of feeling. The real absence. The kind that came from having walked through something and come out somewhere different on the other side. She had been afraid for 4 years. She had managed the fear and worked around it and carried it the way you carry a weight you've learned to distribute properly across your body. She had been so practiced at managing it that she had stopped noticing it as something separate from herself. It had become part of the architecture, part of what held the structure up. Sitting in the cab at 11:30 on a night in October, she noticed its absence. It left a space. She didn't know yet what went in the space, but she could feel its dimensions, and they were considerable. The driver let her out on Delancey. She walked up to the apartment. She looked in on Marco, still on the couch, blanket pulled up, the sound of his specific sleeping breathing that she'd known since he was a child, slightly irregular, always had been. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at him. The bruised face, the taped ribs visible above the blanket where his shirt had ridden up, the wrist brace. He was alive. He was whole. He was 23 years old and spectacularly bad at knowing which men to borrow money from. And he was her brother, and the debt that had written itself into her hands was gone. She went to her room. She sat at the work table. She didn't open anything or spread anything out. She just sat at it in the dark and let the room be what it was. Then she went to bed and she slept for 11 hours and 20 minutes, which she knew because she checked the time when she woke, and it was past noon, and the light coming through the window was the midday light, and the city outside was at full volume. She lay there for a few minutes, not because she was tired anymore, just because she could. Then she got up. The next 3 weeks had the particular quality of aftermath, says the way things go after a structure that has organized your life for a long time stops organizing it. There was a shape missing. She'd known the shape would be missing. She worked around the missing shape the way she worked around the damaged sections of old fabric, carefully, attentively, without forcing it. She called Mrs. Kowalski on Sunday, received, in response, the most efficiently delivered reprimand of her professional life, followed immediately by a list of 3 commissions that needed her attention by end of the following week, delivered in the tone of a woman who had been waiting precisely long enough and was not going to wait a minute longer. She said yes to all 3 and felt, in saying yes, something that was not quite relief and not quite joy but lived somewhere between the two and was enough. She went back to the garment house on Monday. She took the freight elevator. She put her shoulder against the gate for the whole ride up. 3rd floor. Heavy door. Good locks, exactly as they had been. The north window. The light that was gray and merciless and perfect for finding flaws. Her kit on the work table, exactly where she'd left it. She put on her right glove. She left the left one off. She had been doing this. Since the gala, she had been doing this. 1 glove on, 1 off. She was not entirely sure why she'd started. It had not been a decision exactly. It had been a morning where she'd put the right glove on and reached for the left one and then stopped reaching and picked up her needle instead. It had kept happening. She worked. She worked the way she always worked. The particular focus that narrowed the world to the thing in front of her and the relationship between her hands and the material. The relationship that was the oldest reliable thing she knew. The first commission was a 19th century christening gown from a family in Connecticut that had 3 generations of the same damage pattern because 3 generations of the same grandmother had packed it incorrectly. She looked at it for a long time before she started, diagnosed before she committed. She was always slow at the beginning. She was 4 hours into it when Dante came through the back door. He didn't announce it. He never announced it. She had started to understand that this was less about power and more about something habitual. A man who moved through spaces without asking permission, because asking permission had never been something the spaces required of him. She had also started to understand that this was not always appropriate, and that she did not plan to stop pointing that out. "I have a doorbell," she said without looking up. "The buzzer's broken." "It was fixed last week." "Mrs. Kowalski." A pause. "I didn't know." "Now you know." She heard him cross to the chair and sit in it. She kept working. He let her work, which she had also learned about him, that he was comfortable in silence in a way that not many people were, comfortable enough that the silence didn't fill up with the small sounds of discomfort. "The preliminary filing," he said after a while. "I know. Camille called me Friday." She turned the christening gown on its frame. "I'm meeting with her paralegal Wednesday." "You'll need—" "I have what I need." She looked up at him then. "I've been managing my own affairs for a while." He looked back at her with the expression she'd catalogued enough times now to read more completely. The thing that was not quite a smile but occupied the same territory, combined with the specific quality of a man who was learning, actively, to trust a competence that wasn't his, and finding that the learning was more interesting than he'd expected. "The building in Soho," he said. She went still. "The lease came available. Ground floor. Good natural light, I understand. The previous tenant was a photographer." He said it carefully, the way you said something that mattered as though it didn't, in order to give the person hearing it room to respond without pressure. "It would need build-out. Workroom in the back, a front room for whatever you wanted the front room to be. A place that had your name on it." She looked at him. "It's not a gift," he said. "Before you say it, the lease is at market rate. You'd be a tenant." He paused. "A tenant who pays a market rate rent that I understand is manageable on the income from a working restoration practice with a solid commission queue." She was quiet for a long moment. "You looked at my income," she said. "I looked at your commission queue, from Kowalski's files, with Kowalski's knowledge." Another pause. "She thinks you've been undercharging for 3 years. Mara thought about this. She thought about Soho light, which she knew because she'd walked through Soho on the way to other things and looked at the light in the windows the way she always looked at light that was good for working. She thought about her name on a door. Not Bellevere, not Kowalski. Her name. Voss, 4 letters. Her grandmother's name, her mother's name, the name she'd carried from Stuttgart to Vienna to New York. She thought about what it would mean to open a door every morning that said that. "I need to see the space," she said. "I know." Before any other conversation. "I know." "And if the light is wrong," "then it's wrong," he said, "and I'll find a different space." She looked at him. He looked back at her. The room held its breath the way rooms did when the thing being negotiated between 2 people had moved past its technical stage into something that didn't have terms. "Thursday," she said. "I'm free Thursday afternoon." "Thursday," he said. She went back to the christening gown. He stayed in the chair. The pipes knocked twice and went quiet. Outside, the city ran its permanent middle distance, its relentless ordinary hum that she had heard out of this window for 11 months now, and had come to find, if not comforting exactly, then reliable in the way that certain truths were reliable, present whether you acknowledged them or not. 2 weeks after the gala, Camille Okafor filed the preliminary. Mara gave her testimony on a Wednesday morning in a conference room in Midtown that smelled like old carpet and new ambition, and she answered every question with the specific clarity she'd developed over 4 years of paying attention to things that mattered and organizing them in the correct order. The paralegal asked if she needed breaks. She said no. She was there for 4 hours. Walking out, standing on the sidewalk in the November cold, she felt the particular sensation of having set something down that she'd been carrying for so long that setting it down was itself a kind of disorientation. The weight had been familiar. What your hands did without the weight was something you had to learn. She was learning. She visited the Soho space on Thursday. Ground floor, as he'd said. The previous photographer had understood light. The windows ran nearly floor to ceiling along the south wall, and the light that came through them at 2 in the afternoon was the flat, all-directional light that was the closest thing to perfect she'd ever worked under. She stood in the empty room for a long time. She paced the dimensions. She stood in the back room that would be the workroom and held her hands up in the light and looked at them. She said yes. The build-out took 6 weeks. She was involved in every decision, which was not negotiable and which she told the contractor on the first day without apology. She knew what she needed. She had been knowing what she needed for a long time. She had simply been in circumstances that made it impossible. Now the circumstances had changed, and she proceeded accordingly. During the 6 weeks she worked at the garment house, she finished the christening gown commission. She took 2 more from Kowalski's queue. She had lunch, twice, with Camille Okafor in a diner near Camille's current office, where Camille drank black coffee and updated her on the filing's progress with the efficient precision of a woman who communicated in facts and found most other conversational content inefficient, and who Mara, as a result, found she liked quite a lot. She had dinner, once, with Marco. They went to the Italian place on Mott Street that their mother would have loved, that they'd discovered 2 years ago and gone to perhaps 6 times since then, always on occasions that required something more than the apartment and something less formal than an event. Marco's wrist was healing. His ribs had mostly stopped hurting. He'd gotten a job, a real one, a mundane one, data entry at a medical billing company that paid adequately and required nothing of him beyond showing up and being accurate, which were both things he was capable of. He didn't talk about the warehouse. She didn't either. They talked about the job and about the Italian place's ossobuco, and about a streaming series he was watching that he described with the specific enthusiasm of someone who'd found something that had genuinely gotten its hooks in him. And she listened to him talk and ate her ossobuco and felt, for the first time in a long time, the particular texture of an evening that was just an evening. Not managed, not survived, just experienced. He paid. She let him. It cost her something to let him, but a smaller something than it would have cost 6 months ago, which he registered as progress. Walking home, he said, "I know I can't," and stopped, started again. "I know sorry doesn't," stopped again. She kept walking beside him. "I'm going to be better," he said. "I know I say that." "You do say it," she agreed. "I mean it this time differently than I meant it before." She thought about how to respond to that. She thought about what the difference was between the times he'd said it and meant it one way, and the times he said it and meant it another way, and whether she could tell the difference from the outside, and what she would do with that assessment either way. "Okay," she said. "That's all?" "That's what I have tonight." She glanced at him. "It's enough." He nodded. They walked the rest of the way without talking, which was the other version of the kind of silence that was comfortable. The silence between people who've been through something together and found, on the other side of it, that they're still walking in the same direction. The atelier opened on a Tuesday in December. She opened it quietly, without ceremony, because ceremony required an audience, and she had not yet fully decided who the audience was for what she was doing now. She unlocked the door at 7 in the morning and turned the lights on and set her kit on the work table she'd had built from specifications she'd drafted herself. The right height, the right surface, the right arrangement of the tool storage, and she stood in the south window light for a moment. On the door, in simple letters, it said, "Vo S." She put both gloves on. She took the left one off. She left it off. She had a commission waiting. A Victorian-era shawl from a museum upstate that needed stabilization and selective repair, exactly the kind of work that required 3 weeks of careful attention and produced something so close to original that the difference was academic. She set it up. She examined it. She began the process she always began with: diagnosis before commitment, looking before touching, understanding the structure at the level below the visible before deciding where to work. She was an hour into the examination when the door opened. She had left it unlocked because she was open, because she was a business now with a name on a door, and an unlocked door was part of what that meant. Dante came in. He looked at the room, the south light, the work table, the Victorian shawl on its frame, the kit open and organized beside it. He looked at the name on the door from the inside. He looked at her. He was not in the overcoat. A jacket, darker, the collar turned up from the cold outside. He had been walking. She could see it in the slight color in his face from the December air. He had walked here, she decided, which was the behavior of a man who needed the time that walking gave him before arriving somewhere. She looked at him from behind the work table. She held her magnifying glass in her right hand, and her bare left hand was at her side, and the south light was doing its merciless work on the room and on both of them. "You didn't tell me it was today," he said. "I didn't know you'd want to know." He looked at her for a moment. "I would have wanted to know." She set the magnifying glass down on the velvet roll. She thought about 10 days ago, when they'd walked through this space and she'd stood in the back room and held her hands up in the light and said yes. She thought about what yes had meant and what it still meant and what it had been in the process of meaning for the last 6 weeks. "I know," she said. "I'm still learning what to tell you." He held her eyes. The specific quality of his attention, complete, nothing withheld, the quality she'd been reading for 11 months now, did not change and did not soften and did not manage itself. It was simply present. "I know," he said. He looked around the room again. He moved to the window, not close to her, just to the window, looking out at the December street. She watched his profile in the south light and thought about the photograph on his apartment wall, the woman at the sewing machine with her face turned toward the camera. His mother's expression in that photograph, interrupted focus, the look of someone paused mid-work, mid-story, mid-life. "She would have come here," he said. Not a statement about Mara, about his mother. She would have found some excuse to have work done, and she would have come here, and she would have stayed for 3 hours and talked your ear off. He looked out at the street. She did that. Found people she liked and stayed. Mara looked at him. At the back of his head, the silver at his temples, the held quality of his posture that was the posture of a man who had gotten through difficult things by holding himself in a particular way for so long, it had become his natural shape. "Sit down," she said, "if you want to stay." He turned from the window. He looked at the chairs she'd bought for the front room. 2 of them, good chairs, the kind that invited the long stay rather than the courtesy visit. He sat. She picked up her magnifying glass and went back to the Victorian shawl. She worked. He stayed and said nothing. And she worked in the south window light of a December morning in her own room with her name on the door. And the only sounds were the street outside and the quiet of a space that was entirely hers. After a while, half an hour, perhaps more, she had lost track the way she always lost track when the work was going well. She became aware of him moving. She looked up. He had come to the work table. He stood on the opposite side, the way he'd stood in the garment house the first morning, looking at what she was working on with the quality of attention that knew not to touch. She held out the magnifying glass. He took it. He looked at the shawl, the damage pattern, the stabilized sections, the areas she'd marked for attention. He looked for a long time. "I don't know what I'm looking at," he said. "The dark areas along the edge are where the fiber has deteriorated. The pins mark the junctions I'm going to work on first. The places where the structure has pulled loose." She came around the table and stood beside him and pointed, close enough that her shoulder was nearly against his arm. "Here, and here. If I work on those 2 first, the rest of the structure stabilizes enough that I can do the secondary repairs without the whole thing shifting while I work." He looked at where she was pointing. "And if you work on the wrong one first, then the whole thing shifts and I've made the damage worse." She straightened. "So I don't work on the wrong one first." He looked at her, directly, from close range, the way he'd looked at her across the work table in the garment house 9 days after she'd first bled on his mother's wedding veil. "How do you know which one is wrong?" She looked back at him. "You look at it until you understand exactly how it's made," she said. "Then you work with what's there." Something happened in his face, the thing she'd been watching surface and submerge for weeks, for months. It surfaced fully now and stayed there, and she let it stay, and she looked at it without looking away. He gave her back the magnifying glass. His hand, when it transferred, his fingers briefly against hers, the warm reality of another person's hand, stopped on her left hand for a moment. Not a grip, just a stop. He looked down at her hand in his, the scarring, the ring finger. 4 years of damage and 4 years of continuing to work anyway, written into her skin in the language of a debt that was now cleared. She let him look. He turned her hand over slowly. He looked at the palm, the back, the knuckles. She stood still and let him look the way she'd let herself look 11 nights ago in the hospital light, without flinching, without the neutrality she'd practiced, just the direct encounter with what was there. He brought her hand up. She watched him do it. She watched his face as he bent his head, deliberate, unhurried, the same quality he brought to everything he chose to do. She watched him press his mouth to the scarred knuckle of her index finger, held there for a moment, then the next, each one, taking his time, not performing it. There was no theater in it, no orchestration, no looking at her face to see the effect. His eyes were closed. It was entirely private, even done in front of her. She stood still. By the time he reached the ring finger, the one that had split and split and split again, the oldest and deepest of the scars, she was breathing differently than she'd been breathing a minute ago, and she was not going to pretend otherwise, and she did not. He finished. He lowered her hand. He looked at her. She looked back. She looked at him with everything she'd learned in 11 months of garment houses and 4 years of parking structures and 6 days of the finest work of her hands and 2 weeks of living on the other side of what she'd built. And she saw a man who had not offered her rescue and had not offered her safety and had not offered her the particular fiction that everything was simple or easy or without cost, but who had given her his word 3 times and kept it, who had said it's not a mitigation when it would have been very easy to let it be a mitigation, who had walked to a December atelier to say something he apparently needed the walk to arrive at. "I'm not finished working," she said. She said it clearly. Not a warning, a fact. This is not the end of something. This is the beginning of what I'm actually doing." She held his eyes. "I'm not going to be a thing that happened to you. I need to be. I need the space to be what I'm building." "I know," he said. "I mean it." "I know you mean it." He looked at her with the quality of a man who has been paying attention for 11 months and has arrived, through that attention, at something real. "I'm not asking for any version of you except the one that's here." She thought about that, held it up and looked at it the way she looked at materials she didn't fully know yet, carefully, without rushing to a conclusion. "Okay," she said. She said it the way she'd said it to Marco on Mott Street, not as a performance of certainty, not as the end of the conversation, but as the honest available thing. What she had tonight. What was enough to start with? She turned back to the Victorian shawl. She picked up her magnifying glass. She looked at the damaged junctions, the places where the structure had pulled loose over 100 years of being folded and stored and carried and sometimes handled with less care than it deserved. She knew which one to work on first. She picked up her needle. Behind her, she heard the sound of a chair. Him, settling back into it, making himself comfortable in the unhurried way of a man who is, for once, not managing anything, just staying. The south light came through the windows and fell across the work table and across her hands, the right one in its glove, the left one bare, both of them holding the needle and the thread with the precision of a woman who had understood, finally, that the scars were not the story. The scars were what the story had been written on. 2 different things. She began. Outside, December did what December did. Indifferent, clean, the city going about its permanent business of continuing. Snow, perhaps later. The forecast said snow. She worked in the light, and she did not look at her hands, and she did not look away from them either. She simply looked at what was in front of her and understood exactly how it was made, and worked with what was there. That had always been enough.